My father kept that patches, Annie said. She blinked, then quickly corrected herself, her voice growing softer. I mean, that patch, the patch inside your jacket. It looks exactly like my father's. She stood beside table 6, still holding the coffee pot, her eyes fixed on the inside of the man's jacket draped over the back of his chair. One corner of the lining had come loose, and there, embroidered against the dark fabric, was the image of a silver eagle with frayed threads, its wings spread wide with a kind of worn-down pride. The man turned his head. He looked at Annie for a second, then followed her gaze to his jacket. Which patch? He asked. Annie pointed carefully. That one, sir, inside the lining. He lifted the edge of the jacket with 2 fingers. The silver eagle came into clearer view. One wing was frayed, but it still carried a proud shape. This? He said. You mean this silver eagle? Yes, sir, Annie replied. My father used to have one just like it. The man stared at her. Then he laughed. It was not a warm laugh. It was a clear, open scoff, full of contempt. Annie felt her face grow hot. The man leaned back in his chair, still smiling as if she had told him a story so ridiculous that he could not be bothered to correct it kindly. Your father had one exactly like this? He asked. Yes, sir. He let out a small breath through his nose, mockery plain on his face. Young lady, I don't know what your father had, but I can assure you, it could not have been one of these. Annie tightened her hand around the handle of the coffee pot. I'm telling the truth, she said. I saw it. More than once. My father kept it in a wooden box. Before he died, he gave it to my mother. The smile on the man's face suddenly faded. Annie turned toward the kitchen and called over her shoulder. Mom, we have a badge just like this, don't we? Dad's silver eagle badge? The kitchen door swung open almost immediately. Rose Brooks stepped out, holding a plate of fried catfish, collard greens, and cornbread. She had been about to call out to Mr. Ellis that his hot sauce was on its way, but the words caught in her throat when she saw the table. Rose's eyes moved from Annie to the man, then stopped on the jacket hanging over the chair. The plate in her hands lowered. Mom? Annie asked. Dad had one like that too, didn't he? Rose stood still for a moment. Yes, she said softly. Your father once had one exactly like that. The man's eyebrows rose. For a moment, he looked caught between surprise and irritation. Then the contempt returned, sharper than before. He let out a short laugh. Then another, louder this time. Well, isn't that something? He said, looking from Annie to Rose. First your daughter tells me her father had one just like it, and now you're saying the same thing. He laughed again. The sound was loud enough to make several customers in the diner turn their heads. The man gestured toward the jacket, as if its value alone was enough to end the argument. Do people around here always claim whatever they see on a stranger's table? Rose's expression changed, but only slightly. My husband had that patch, Rose said. I don't need your permission to remember what was once in my own home. The man sat up straighter. Ma'am, with all due respect, that is impossible. With all due respect, Rose replied. You don't know what was in my house. The older woman sitting across from him placed her napkin on the table. William, let it go. William touched the patch inside his jacket. This silver eagle was not made for sale. It is not something a man could pick up at a flea market or buy off a rack just because he liked the way it looked. Rose looked straight at him. I never said my husband bought it. Then where did he get it? Rose did not answer. William gave a thin smile. That's what I thought. Annie stepped closer to her mother. Mom, show him. Rose looked at her. Annie, please, Mom, Annie said, her voice growing smaller. He thinks we're lying. I don't think that, William said. I know it. Annie turned to look at him. No, sir. You know what you have. You don't know what my father had. That wiped the smile from William's face. Rose placed one hand on the edge of the plate she had just set down on the table. Annie, we don't owe this man anything. I know, Annie said. But Dad kept that patch for all those years. Maybe he wanted there to be one day when nobody laughed at it anymore. Rose looked toward the back room, where the wooden box still sat beneath neatly folded tablecloths in the cabinet she opened only on days when the grief was too heavy for her to stand upright. Then she looked at her daughter, in the shape of Annie's mouth, in the way she stood tall when someone tried to make her feel small. Rose saw Daniel again. Go get the jacket, Rose said. Annie blinked. Dad's jacket? Rose nodded. And the box. Annie handed the coffee pot to the girl behind the counter, then hurried down the narrow hallway to the back room. The air there held the faint smell of flour, dish soap, and old wood. She opened the lower cabinet, lifted the carefully folded tablecloths, and took out the wooden box first. Then she took Daniel's old work jacket from the hook behind the storage room door. It was a faded brown canvas jacket, soft and worn thin at the elbows. Rose had washed it after he died, then cried because the soap had taken away the last trace of his scent, still clinging to the fabric. Annie carried both of them back into the dining room. William watched her approach. His face still showed disbelief, but beneath that doubt, something else had begun to stir. Annie laid the jacket on the table. Rose opened the wooden box and took out a white handkerchief. Inside it was the silver eagle patch Daniel had kept for so many years, the patch he had given Rose when his hands had become too weak to hold on to anything tightly. Then Rose turned the jacket inside out. On the inner lining, there was a faint outline where the patch had once been sewn. The shape of the eagle still remained on the fabric, marked by old needle holes and a square of cloth that had faded less than the rest. Annie pointed to it. He wore it there at first. Then he took it off and kept it in the box. William stared. Rose placed Daniel's patch beside his jacket. "Look at it," Annie said. "Please look closely." William hesitated, then reached into his own jacket and gently pulled at the threads holding the patch in place. He set his silver eagle down beside Daniel's. The whole diner seemed to grow silent around that table. They matched. The same eagle, the same silver thread, the same wings, worn down by time. William's face hardened. But this time, it was not contempt. It was resistance. He was fighting against what his own eyes had just shown him. "No," he said. "No, there were only two of them." Rose's voice was very quiet. "Then maybe my husband had the other one." William looked up at her. "What was his name?" "Daniel Brooks," Annie said. Rose's eyes lowered for a moment, then lifted again. "He was Daniel Brooks in the life we built together." William heard the way she said it. "In the life you built together?" he repeated. "What does that mean?" Rose did not answer. The older woman suddenly stood up. "William, this is ridiculous. We are not doing this in a diner." At last, Rose looked over at her. "No one asked you to do anything, ma'am." William picked up Daniel's patch between two fingers. His hand stayed steady until he turned it over. Then it was no longer steady. On the back, written in faded black ink, were the words, "D and W Brothers, never lost." The older woman fell silent. William stared at the writing. For one long moment, all the contempt disappeared from his face. "Where did you get this?" he asked. Rose's answer was firm. "From my husband." "What was his full name?" Rose was silent. Annie looked at her mother. "Mom?" Rose touched the edge of Daniel's jacket. "Your father didn't like that old name." "What old name?" Annie asked. William's eyes slowly lifted. Rose looked straight at him. "His birth name was Daniel Whitmore," she said. The words moved through the diner like a sudden storm sweeping across the small room. William's lips parted, but no sound came out. Annie stared at her mother. "Whitmore?" Rose turned to her daughter. All the strength in her face seemed to collapse under the weight of the secret she had buried for so many years. "Yes, sweetheart." William slowly sank back into his chair. "No," he said. Rose's voice did not tremble. "Yes." The older woman clutched her purse tightly. "This proves nothing." Rose looked at the patch, then at Daniel's jacket, and finally at Annie. "It proves enough," she said. "It proves he had someone with him once. And even after everything that happened, no one ever came looking for him." William flinched. Annie looked from her mother to the man sitting across from them. Only minutes earlier, he had laughed at her as if she were nothing more than a foolish waitress reaching for something far above her place. Now he looked like a man who had just discovered that the thing he mocked was tied to someone dead whom he might once have loved. William touched the writing on the back of the patch. "D and W," he whispered. Annie's throat tightened. "Daniel and William?" He did not answer right away. When William finally lifted his eyes to her, they were red with tears. "Did your father ever mention having a brother?" he asked. Annie shook her head. "No. He only kept the patch." William covered his mouth with his hand, but it did not stop the broken sound that rose from his throat. Rose closed the wooden box. The latch clicked softly, but in that silence, the sound seemed much louder than usual. William kept his eyes fixed on the tabletop, staring at the two silver eagle patches lying side by side. His patch looked as though it had been carefully preserved. Daniel's looked as though it had lived through an entire lifetime of storms. That difference troubled him more than he wanted to admit. Annie looked at her mother. "Mom, what did you mean when you said Dad was born with the name Daniel Whitmore?" Rose did not answer quickly enough, and that delay hurt more than the answer itself. Annie took one step back from the table. "You knew about this?" Rose turned to her. "Sweetheart." "No." Annie shook her head. "Don't comfort me right now. You knew Dad had another name?" Rose's face tightened, not out of anger, but because she was trying to keep herself standing in front of nearly the whole town. "Yes." "And you never told me?" "I meant to." "When?" Rose looked down at the wooden box. "When I could say it without hurting you even more." Annie let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh, but there was no amusement in it. "Mom, I've been carrying a pain I didn't even know had a name." William looked up. He wanted to say something, but Rose stopped him before he could open his mouth. "Not you." He froze. Rose picked up Daniel's jacket from the table and folded it with both hands. She folded it the same way she had folded it after his funeral. Sleeve over sleeve. Careful around the worn elbows, avoiding the collar where Daniel's skin had darkened the fabric over the years. The older woman wearing pearls still stood near William's chair, her lips pressed tightly together. She did not touch the patch. She did not touch the box either. She looked at all of it as if the truth were something filthy that had been spilled near her shoes. At last, William spoke. "Mrs. Brooks." Rose looked at him. "I need to ask you something." "You need a lot of things," Rose said, "but that doesn't mean I have to lay all of them out on my dining table for you." A few customers turned their faces away, embarrassed to have heard things they knew they would never forget. Mr. Ellis, sitting at the counter, quietly slipped a $5 bill under his coffee cup and stood up. "Rose," he said softly, "do you want me to ask everyone to leave?" Rose looked at him. For a moment, the hardness in her face softened. "No, Mr. Ellis, you go ahead and finish your lunch. I'm finished." He put on his hat, and I think most of us are too. Within a few minutes, the lunch crowd had left the diner. Without them, the room suddenly felt larger and colder. Only Annie, Rose, William, Margaret, and the young cook named Marcus remained. Marcus stood in the kitchen area, looking out with his eyebrows raised in silent question. Rose gave a small nod toward the back. He disappeared at once without saying a word. Annie still stood near the table, her arms folded over her apron. "Must Dad rich?" Rose closed her eyes for a moment. "No, at least, not when I knew him. That's not what I asked." Rose looked straight into her daughter's eyes. "He was born into a wealthy family, but he didn't live off their money." Margaret let out a small sound of displeasure. Rose turned to her. "Do you have something to say?" Margaret's gaze moved over Rose's apron, the worn counter, the handwritten menu board, and then settled on Annie. "This conversation should not be happening here." Rose gave a short nod. "You're right. It should have happened years ago, in a house where my husband was still welcome." William flinched again. Margaret looked at him. "Do not take on guilt that does not belong to you." Rose gave a tired little laugh. "That must be a familiar comfort in your family." William stood. "Mother." "No," Margaret said. "I will not stand here and watch strangers rewrite history." Annie lifted her head. "Strangers?" Margaret seemed to realize she had gone too far, but pride would not let her take the word back. Annie stepped closer to the table. "My father carried your family name. My mother kept his jacket. That patch has your family's initials on it, and you still call us strangers?" For the first time, Margaret truly looked at Annie, not just glanced past her as if she were a waitress. "I mean that every claim requires proof." William turned the patch over and stared at the faded ink. "Mother, it could have been copied." "It wasn't." "You don't know that." William's voice lowered. "Yes, I do." The room seemed to hold on to that answer. Rose looked at him. "Why?" William did not want to answer. Annie could see it in the way his hand tightened around the edge of the table. Some truths were not hidden because people were unsure. Some truths were hidden because once spoken aloud, they demanded responsibility. At last, he chose his share of that responsibility. "When Daniel and I were boys," he said, "we found these two patches in an old military surplus store outside Macon. They weren't real military patches. The shop owner said a man had once ordered them for some kind of club, but the club never used them. There were only two left. Daniel bought both of them. He paid with money he had earned mowing lawns." The corner of his mouth moved slightly. It was not a smile. just a shard of memory passing through grief. He said an eagle didn't need anyone's permission before leaving the ground. I told him that sounded ridiculous. He said I would understand when I grew up. Annie listened, even though part of her did not want to. William continued. He kept one and gave me one. Then he wrote on the back of his. I didn't write anything on mine, because at the time I thought things like that were sentimental nonsense. Rose's voice suddenly softened. He was sentimental. Yes, William said. He always was. Annie looked at the patch in William's hand. Dad never told me that story. Rose touched the box. Your father buried a lot of things. Why? Rose glanced at Margaret, then looked back at Annie. Because there were things people had already made him pay for. William understood that. Shame crossed his face before he could hide it. Annie saw it, but she did not know what to do with it. Margaret reached for her purse. William, we are leaving. He did not move. Did he have any children? William asked Rose, though his eyes had already turned toward Annie. Rose's answer was clear. One daughter. Annie, he said, as if testing the name on his tongue. Annie did not like the way her name sounded in his mouth. That's right. William looked at Rose. Daniel's daughter. Rose met his eyes. Yes. He slowly sat down again. Not because he was weak, but as if he had just lost to the truth. Margaret stepped back from the table. We didn't know that. At last, Rose's patience ran out, though her voice remained low. You didn't know because you chose not to know anything about him after he left that house. Margaret's face hardened. He made his own choice. Rose leaned over the table, both palms flat against the worn wood. No, you forced him to make a choice. Those are two different things, and every woman in this room understands that. Annie looked at her mother. She had seen Rose angry before, but never like this. This anger had deep roots. It was older than medical bills, older than widowhood, older than the diner itself. It came from a door Annie had never seen, and from a family that had slammed that door shut. William whispered, What happened after he left? Rose looked at him as if she could hardly believe it. You're asking that now? I'm asking now. That doesn't make you noble. I know. The simple answer made Rose pause for a moment. She straightened. He worked. That's what happened. He fixed cars. He washed dishes. He learned how to make biscuits because mine kept turning out hard after long shifts. He patched the roof when it leaked. He held our daughter every time she cried. He got sick, but he kept working longer than a sick man should, because healthcare in this country can humble a decent man faster than sin. Annie turned her face away. Rose's voice grew hoarse, but she did not stop. And when he died in the back room of this diner. On a bed we had to move down there because he could no longer climb the stairs. One of his hands was holding mine. The other was holding that patch. William closed his eyes. Margaret said nothing. Annie had never known that last detail. She knew her father had died holding Rose's hand, but she had not known about the patch. Rose turned to her daughter. That morning, your father gave it to me. He told me to keep it safe. He said that if you ever asked, I should tell you he loved you more than any name he had ever lost. Annie's face crumpled before she could stop it. Oh, Mom, if this story touched your heart, please give this video a like. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, because we love knowing how far these stories travel. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories about family, truth, and the moments that change everything. Rose reached toward Annie, but Annie stepped back, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. She was not rejecting her mother. She was simply trying not to fall apart in front of strangers, even if one of those strangers might be blood. William stood again, this time more slowly and carefully. Mrs. Brooks, I would like to speak with you privately. Rose looked at him. I don't think you deserve privacy. He accepted that. Annie picked up Daniel's patch before anyone else could touch it. Was he your brother? William looked at her, and every answer he had prepared disappeared. Yes, he said. If your father was Daniel Whitmore, then he was my brother. If? His eyes lowered. Annie tightened her grip on the patch. You still need conditions? No, William said quietly. I suppose I don't. Margaret's cold voice came from behind him. I do. Rose looked at Margaret for a long time, then picked up Daniel's jacket and draped it over Annie's shoulders. The jacket was too large for her, its sleeves hanging past her wrists. But Annie did not move to take it off. Rose said, Then you can keep needing them somewhere else. Margaret stared at her. What did you just say? My diner is closed. William turned to his mother. Mother, wait in the car. Margaret looked as though he had slapped her. William, please. It was not a request meant for argument. Margaret gathered her purse, her gloves, and what remained of her dignity. When she reached the door, she stopped and glanced at Annie and Daniel's old jacket. Something passed over her face, too quickly to name, then vanished. The bell above the door rang as she left. William stayed. Rose folded her arms across her chest. You have 5 minutes. He nodded. For a man accustomed to boardrooms, signatures, and people waiting on his every word, he looked painfully unsure of where to put his hands. I did try to find him once, he said. Rose's expression did not change. Not enough, he added. It was the first thing Annie had heard from him that she believed was sincere. William looked down at the floor. I told myself he didn't want to be found. I told myself that if he needed me, he would call. I told myself a lot of things that made me feel better. Rose said, people who live with plenty can survive on lies for a very long time. Yes, William said, they can. Annie watched him. The contempt from earlier was gone, but it had not yet faded from her memory. William lifted his eyes. May I see a photograph of him? Rose almost said no. Annie could feel it. But then Rose saw Daniel's jacket on her daughter's shoulders, and she seemed to change her mind for Daniel's sake, not William's. She opened the wooden box again and took out a faded photograph. Years before, Daniel had stood outside Rose's diner with one arm around his wife and little Annie sitting on his hip. He was wearing that brown jacket, one sleeve stained with grease, sunlight falling across his face. He looked tired, happy, and heartbreakingly alive. William took the photograph with both hands. The moment he saw Daniel, the last of his defenses collapsed. He pressed the photograph to his chest and bent forward. He did not sob loudly. He did not perform his grief. He simply held a loss he had arrived too late to receive. Annie looked at her mother, and Rose's face was wet with tears now too. Outside, a black car sat close to the curb. Inside it, Margaret Whitmore sat upright, staring straight ahead. Inside the diner, William held the photograph of the brother he had not found in time, and Annie stood there in her father's old jacket, feeling clearly for the first time that the past had never truly stayed behind them. William left Rose's kitchen with Daniel's photograph still in his hands. He did not remember walking to the car. He remembered the bell above the diner door. He remembered the smell of coffee following him into the afternoon heat. He remembered Margaret sitting in the back seat of the black Lincoln, her chin lifted, her gloved hands folded over her purse as if posture alone could keep the world from changing. The driver opened the door. William did not get in. Sir? The driver asked. William looked down at the photograph again. Daniel stood in front of the diner, one arm around Rose, a little girl on his hip, Annie, though William had not known her name then. Daniel's hair was thinner than it had been in youth, his face leaner, his shirt plain, his old work jacket stained at the cuff, but the smile was Daniel's. Not the smile from newspaper rooms or formal family dinners, the real one, the one William had not seen since before their mother began measuring love against reputation. Margaret's window lowered with a soft hum. Get in the car, William. He looked at her. You knew where he was. Her expression did not change. I knew he had chosen a life apart from us. That is not what I asked. The driver stood very still beside the open door, pretending not to hear. Across the street, a man loading feed bags into a pickup slowed just enough to look. Margaret's eyes moved to the diner, then back to William. Not here. William gave a short laugh, nothing like the one he had used on Annie. This one had no cruelty in it. Only disbelief. That seems to be the family motto. Lower your voice. Did you know Daniel lived here? Margaret's lips pressed together. William nodded once, because the silence was answer enough. How long? She looked forward through the windshield. Years ago, I heard something. From whom? People talk. Mother. She turned on him then, sharp. Do not use that tone with me on a sidewalk. William stepped closer to the car. My brother died last spring. Her face flickered. Not much. Enough. You did know, he said. No, she said quickly. I did not know he had died. But you knew he had a wife. I knew there was a woman. A woman? William repeated. Her name is Rose. Margaret's jaw tightened. She was the reason he left. No, William said. You were. The words came out before he weighed them. Once spoken, they did not feel reckless. They felt overdue. Margaret stared at him as if she no longer recognized the son standing on the curb. Daniel made his decision. He was forced to make it. He could have come home. Could he? William asked. With Rose? With Annie? Could he have walked through our front door with his black wife and his daughter and sat at your table like your son? Margaret looked away. That was answer enough, too. William closed his hand around the photograph. I'm not going home yet. William, don't be absurd. I need to think. You need to stop before you embarrass this family. He leaned down toward the open window. This family should have been embarrassed 20 years ago. Then he turned and walked down the sidewalk before she could answer. He did not know where he was going. Bell Creek's main street was only a few blocks long, a pharmacy with a faded green awning, a barber shop with 2 old men sitting outside, a hardware store, a Baptist church at the end of the street with a sign announcing Wednesday supper. William passed all of it with Daniel's photo in his hand and the silver eagle patch in his coat pocket, feeling like a man who had mistaken motion for direction his entire life. He stopped near the church. Under an oak tree beside the parking lot stood an old wooden bench. William sat. For the first time in years, he ignored his phone when it buzzed. He looked at the photograph again and let himself go back. Daniel had been 7 years older, which in boyhood meant he was nearly a grown man, nearly a legend. He could climb the water tower without looking down. He could throw a baseball hard enough to make the catcher curse. He could take apart a radio and put it back together with 2 screws left over, then claim those screws had been extra government waste. William had followed him everywhere. Don't step there, Daniel would say, crossing creek stones. That one rolls. William would step there anyway, fall in, and Daniel would laugh until William got mad. Then Daniel would reach down and pull him up. That was the thing about Daniel. He laughed first, but he always reached. The silver eagle patches came from a junk shop outside Macon during a summer when their father was still alive, and Margaret had not yet hardened into the woman who treated softness like poor breeding. Daniel had found them in a cigar box near old belt buckles and cracked military buttons. Look at these, Daniel said. William had frowned. They're ugly. They are not ugly. They're noble. You don't even know what noble means. Means it looks like it could beat up a rooster. William had laughed so hard the shop owner told them to either buy something or quit breathing on the glass. Daniel spent $3 on both patches. Lawn mowing money. He gave one to William in the truck on the ride home. What am I supposed to do with it? William asked. Keep it. Why? Daniel looked out the window, wind pushing his hair back. So if we ever get lost, we remember. William had rolled his eyes. We live in the same house. Not forever, little brother. That night, Daniel wrote on the back of his patch, D&W brothers don't get lost. William teased him for being dramatic. Daniel threw a sock at his head. For years, the patches meant nothing and everything. Daniel wore his inside a denim jacket. William kept his in a drawer, then later sewed it into a coat after Daniel left, though he never told anyone why. He had told himself it was habit, a keepsake, nothing more. Now he understood it had been gilt with stitches around it. His phone buzzed again. This time he answered. What? He said. Margaret's voice came tight through the line. The driver and I are at the car. You will return now. No. William, I'm going back to Atlanta tonight, alone. You will not leave me here. I'll send the car for you. A pause. You are behaving like a child. No, William said. I behaved like a child when Daniel walked out and I stayed quiet. The line went silent. He could hear her breathing. Then she said, You think silence is so simple. It was simple enough when it benefited us. You know nothing about what I carried. William closed his eyes. Then tell me. But Margaret did not. She never had when truth required humility. Come back to the car, she said. William ended the call. For several minutes he sat under the oak, listening to the late afternoon sounds of Bell Creek. Tires on warm pavement, a screen door slapping shut, somebody laughing outside the barber shop, church bells marking the hour because Old Town still liked to remind people time was passing even when they pretended not to notice. He took Daniel's photograph and slid it into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. Then he walked back toward Rose's kitchen. The diner sign had been flipped to closed, but the lights were still on. Through the window he saw Rose at the counter, wiping the same spot again and again. Annie sat in a booth wearing Daniel's old jacket, the sleeves covering half her hands. She looked smaller than she had when she stood up to him. William did not knock right away. Inside, Annie was speaking. Did Daddy ever ask about them? Rose stopped wiping. Annie looked at her mother. About his family. Rose folded the cloth. Sometimes. What did you say? I told him if he wanted to call, he should call. And? Rose glanced toward the window but did not see William. He said a man can only stand outside a locked door so many times before he starts calling the sidewalk home. Annie looked down at the jacket. Was he ashamed of us? Rose crossed the diner so fast the question hardly had room to settle. She sat across from Annie and took her hands. No. Don't you put that on yourself. Your father was proud of you before you were born. He was proud of the first cry you made in that hospital room. He was proud when you learned to read, when you burned your first pancake, when you told Mrs. Hanley she was wrong for calling Marcus boy. He was proud every day of being your father. Then why hide all this? Because being proud doesn't mean pain stops hurting. Annie's eyes filled, but she held Rose's gaze. I wish he told me. So do I, Rose said. But your daddy thought he was protecting you from wanting people who might not want you back. William closed his eyes. He had no right to hear this. He knew it. Still, he stood there, punished by every word. Behind him, a car door shut. Margaret had come back from the curb, her face controlled, though her eyes had reddened. She saw William at the window and followed his gaze inside. For once, she did not speak. Rose noticed them then. Her face changed. William stepped to the door and knocked. Annie stiffened. Rose stood. For a moment, William thought she would ignore him, and he would have deserved it. But after a few seconds, she came to the door and opened it only halfway. We're closed. I know. Then you can read. Margaret drew herself up behind him, but William lifted one hand without looking back, asking her not to speak. I'm not asking to come in, he said. I just wanted to say something before I leave. Rose waited. William looked past her to Annie, then back. I laughed at your daughter. Yes, you did. I was cruel. Yes. I'm sorry. Rose did not soften. Tell her. William turned his eyes to Annie. She had not moved from the booth. I'm sorry, Annie, he said. You told the truth, and I mocked you because it was easier than being afraid of what you might be saying. Annie watched him for a long moment. You sounded sure. I was. That was the problem. Margaret shifted behind him. William, enough. Rose's eyes went to her. No, let him finish. It's the first useful thing he said. William accepted that too. He reached into his pocket and took out his own silver eagle patch. I thought there were only two because there were only two. Daniel had the other. If your father had it, then your father was Daniel Whitmore. Annie stood slowly. William's voice roughened. And if that is true, I spent more than 20 years not finding my brother while he built a life 20 miles from roads my family drove every week. Rose's face gave nothing away. Annie came closer, still wrapped in Daniel's jacket. What do you want? The question was simple. It also stripped him bare. William looked at her, this girl who might be his niece, who had her father's steadiness and her mother's courage, and for the first time in decades he did not reach for language polished enough to protect himself. I want to know what I missed, he said. And I want to know how much of it was because I was lied to, and how much was because I was a coward. Rose looked at him then with something close to surprise. Margaret said his name softly, warning and wounded at once. William did not turn. Annie held out her hand. Not for comfort. For the patch. He placed it in her palm. She studied it beside the one from her father's box. 2 old eagles, 2 brothers, one rich, one gone. Both carried longer than anyone had admitted. Annie looked up. You can't come in tonight, she said. William nodded. I understand. But Mama opens at 6. Rose looked at her daughter. Annie kept her eyes on William. If you really want to know what you missed, you can start by having breakfast where he used to sit. William's throat worked. I'll be here, he said. Rose did not invite him. She did not forgive him. But she did not close the door right away either. That small mercy was more than William had earned. As he turned to leave, Margaret caught his sleeve. This will not end well. William looked back through the diner window. Annie had returned to the booth, Daniel's jacket around her shoulders. Rose stood beside her, one hand resting on the girl's back. It already didn't, he said. That's why we're here. At 6 the next morning, Rose unlocked the front door of the diner and found William Whitmore standing under the awning with 2 coffees in a cardboard tray. She looked at the cups, then at him. You brought coffee to a diner. He glanced down as if he had only just realized the mistake. That was stupid. It was. I didn't sleep much. That doesn't make it smarter. For the first time since he had stepped into her life wearing a rich man's coat and a dead man's memory, William almost smiled. It did not last. Rose opened the door and walked in without inviting him, but she left it open. He understood that was the invitation. Inside, the diner was still waking up. Chairs were stacked on a few tables. The griddle was cold. The pie case hummed softly near the counter. A thin gray morning pressed against the windows. Rose tied on her apron, flipped on the coffee maker, and nodded toward the last booth by the wall. "That was Daniel's spot after closing," she said. "If you're here to learn something, start there." William sat, the vinyl seat sighed under him. He placed the store-bought coffee on the table and did not touch it again. Rose moved behind the counter, measuring grounds, checking biscuit dough, turning on the small radio but keeping the volume low. For several minutes, she did not speak. William did not rush her. Men with money often believed waiting was something other people did for them. That morning, he waited because it was the only decent thing he knew how to do. Annie came in from the back room with her hair pulled up and Daniel's old jacket folded over one arm. She stopped when she saw him. "You came," she said. "I said I would. People say a lot of things." "Yes," William said. "They do." She studied him, then set the jacket behind the counter. "Mama makes better coffee than whatever that is. I figured that out too late." Rose poured him a mug, black, no sugar, and placed it in front of him. Daniel drank it that way. Said cream was for men who didn't trust the bean. William looked at the mug. He used to say that about everything. He got worse with age. Annie looked at her mother. There was something in Rose's voice Annie had not heard in months. Not happiness. That was too clean a word. But a worn kind of warmth had moved through the grief for a second, and Annie noticed it the way a person notices a lamp in a house they thought had gone dark. William wrapped both hands around the mug. "How did you meet him?" Rose leaned back against the counter. "You really want the story?" "I want whatever you're willing to tell. That's a safer answer than you deserve." "I know." Rose looked toward the front window. Outside, Bell Creek was beginning its day. A school bus rolled past empty. Heading toward its first pickup, a man in a feed store cap unlocked the hardware shop across the street. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked at nothing. "He came in dirty," Rose said. That was the first thing. Not poor dirty, work dirty. Grease on his hands, dust on his jeans, hair sticking up like he'd fought with an engine and lost. "I was waiting tables at Mabel's back then, before this place was mine." He ordered sweet tea and asked if anybody knew a mechanic. Annie slipped into the booth across from William. She had heard pieces of this story, but never with this much room around it. Rose continued, "I told him my cousin could take a look. He said he didn't need a cousin, he needed a wrench. Mabel told him not to get smart in her dining room. He apologized like she was the governor." William looked down. "That sounds like him. He fixed the car himself out back. Then he fixed Mabel's walk in cooler because he said it was making a noise that offended him. Stayed 3 hours. Wouldn't take money. Mabel fed him chicken and dumplings and told him he had the manners of a decent man hiding under bad hair." Annie smiled despite herself. Rose saw it and kept going. "He came back 2 days later. Said he was passing through. Bell Creek is not on the way to anywhere, so I knew he was lying." William's hand tightened around the mug. "He was always bad at casual. He was worse at pretending not to care." Rose's smile faded. "For a while, I didn't ask where he came from. He didn't offer. I knew he had money behind him because of the way he didn't think about money. Poor people count before they order. Daniel didn't count, but he learned. Fast." "What changed?" Annie asked. Rose looked at her daughter. "I fell in love with him before I knew his last name could hurt me." The words settled into the booth. William did not move. "When did you find out?" Annie asked. "Summer storm," Rose said. "Power went out. He and I were stuck closing Mabel's with candles on the counter. A newspaper was sitting near the register. There was a picture of some charity dinner in Atlanta. Your father was in it, standing behind Mrs. Whitmore. She did not say Margaret. I asked him if he had a twin in a tuxedo. He went quiet. Then he told me. Daniel Whitmore. Old money. Big house. Big rules. Mother who believed family was a kingdom, and love was something you approved on paper." William closed his eyes. Rose looked at him. Does that sound unfair? No. Good. I'm tired of being fair to people who had lawyers for their feelings. Annie looked between them. Did he tell Grandma Margaret about you? Rose gave a small, humorless laugh. Not right away. He wanted to. I asked him not to. Why? Because I knew what I was. And I knew what people like that saw first. William lifted his head. Rose. No, she said. Don't clean it up. I was a black waitress with 2 uniforms. A used Chevy. And a mother buried before I was old enough to ask half the questions I had. Your family had gates. Daniel thought love would be enough to walk through them. I knew gates were built for a reason. Annie sat very still. Rose softened her voice for her daughter, but not the truth. When he finally told them, your grandmother sent for me. William's face changed. She met you? Rose nodded. At the Whitmore house. I had never seen anything like it. Floors so shiny I was afraid to step wrong. Paintings of dead people watching from the walls. A woman at the door looked at me like I had come to deliver laundry. William's eyes dropped. Your mother received me in a sitting room, Rose said. She did not offer coffee. She did not ask about my family. She looked at me for a long time and said, Miss Brooks, my son is going through a restless period. Annie's mouth opened a little. Rose looked at William. I remember every word. People think cruel things get forgotten if they say them calmly. William whispered. What else did she say? She said Daniel had obligations. She said young men sometimes confused rebellion with romance. She said I seemed like a practical girl. Rose walked to the register, opened the drawer, and took out a folded paper Annie had never seen. It was old, softened at the creases. Rose laid it on the table. William stared at it. What is that? The number she wrote down. An account. She told me there would be $10,000 in it if I left town and did not contact Daniel again. Annie stood so fast the booth seat snapped back. She paid you to leave Daddy? She tried. William reached for the paper, then stopped. May I? Rose nodded. He unfolded it. Margaret's handwriting sat there in blue ink. Neat and controlled. With a bank name and a number that had never held the future she tried to buy. William's jaw worked. I didn't know. I believe that, Rose said, but not knowing helped you more than it helped us. Annie walked away toward the counter, then turned back. What did Daddy do when he found out? Rose's eyes changed. The memory hurt, but there was pride in it too. He drove to Atlanta that night, came back near dawn with one suitcase, that brown jacket, and the silver eagle patch sewn inside. He said, I lost a house, Rosie. I didn't lose myself. William looked down at the paper in his hand. Rose continued. He waited for you to call. William did not breathe. He said you were young. He said maybe they weren't letting you. He said maybe you needed time. The first Christmas. He bought you a card. Didn't mail it. The next year, he wrote a letter. Then another. After Annie was born, he wrote more. Annie turned toward her mother. Letters? Rose nodded. Some he mailed. Some he didn't. The ones he mailed never came back. But no answer came either. William's voice was quiet. I never received them. Rose looked at him for a long time. Then someone made sure you didn't. The front bell jingled. All three turned. Margaret Whitmore stood in the doorway. She wore yesterday's pride with a different dress. Navy this time. Her pearls bright against her throat. She looked first at William, then at the folded paper in his hand. Her face tightened. Rose said, We're not open yet. Margaret stepped inside. I need to speak with my son. Annie moved beside her mother. He's having breakfast. Margaret looked at Annie, and the old habit almost came out, the one that would have dismissed a young black girl in an apron as part of the room instead of part of the reckoning. But something in Annie's face stopped her. William stood. Did you keep Daniel's letters from me? Margaret did not ask what letters. That was enough. William's face went still. Mother. She lifted her chin. I did what was necessary. Rose laughed once, low and bitter. Necessary. That word must have done a lot of dirty work in your life. Margaret turned to her. You have no idea what Daniel was throwing away. Rose stepped from behind the counter. He threw away a house that made him choose between his mother and his wife. I'd say he knew exactly what he was leaving. He was my son. He was my husband, Rose said. And while you were punishing him for loving me, he was here learning how to be happy without your permission. Margaret flinched at that. Not much, but Annie saw it. William held up the paper. You tried to buy her off. I tried to protect the family. From Rose? From scandal. From gossip. From a mistake that would have followed him forever. Annie's voice came clear from beside the counter. I'm the mistake, aren't I? The room went silent. Margaret looked at her. For a second, no one moved. Rose said, Annie, but Annie did not take it back. That's what you mean. Maybe not then, because I wasn't born yet. But that's where the sentence goes. Margaret's mouth opened, then closed. William looked at his mother as if he had never seen her fully until that moment. Answer her, he said. Margaret's eyes shone, but her voice stayed controlled. I did not know you existed. Annie nodded once. But if you had? No answer came. Rose reached for Annie's hand. Annie let her take it this time. William set the paper on the table. I'm going to find the letters. Margaret turned sharply. You will do no such thing. Yes, William said. I will. They are gone. He stared at her. What does that mean? Margaret looked away, and there it was, the next locked door. Rose saw it. Annie saw it. William saw it too. For the first time that morning, William sounded less like a wounded man, and more like someone who understood the wound had an address. No, he said. They're not gone. You wouldn't destroy them. Not Daniel's handwriting. Not even you. Margaret's face gave the smallest betrayal. William stepped away from the booth. Where are they? Margaret said nothing. Rose folded her arms. Mrs. Whitmore, if you've kept my husband's words locked in some drawer all these years, then you and I are going to have a problem no money can solve. Margaret looked at Rose, and for once there was no quick answer waiting. Outside, the first real customers of the morning began parking along the curb. Inside, the coffee grew bitter on the burner. Biscuits rose in the oven, and Annie stood between the mother who had protected her from a name and the family that had buried it. William picked up Daniel's patch and placed it gently back in Annie's hand. I'll find them, he said. Annie looked at him. Don't say it because it sounds good. I'm not. Then say what you mean. William looked at Margaret, then at Rose, then back at Annie. I mean, he said, if my brother spent his life reaching for me, I'm done letting this family hide his hand. By 7:30, Rose's kitchen was open, but no one inside felt like the day had truly begun. The first customers came in with the usual greetings, the usual requests, the same old complaints about knees, weather, gas prices, and coffee that needed warming before it had cooled. Rose served them because that was what she did. Bills did not pause for family ghosts. Grief never once paid the light company. Annie moved between tables with a smile that looked almost right if no one studied it too long. William sat in the back booth with Daniel's photograph on the table. Untouched coffee beside his hand. Margaret had left 20 minutes earlier. Not because she was finished, but because staying meant answering questions she had spent half her life training herself not to hear. Before she walked out, she told William she would wait at the house in Atlanta. He told her he was going to the Whitmore estate first. That was the first time Annie heard the place called an estate instead of a house. After the breakfast rush thinned, Rose came to his table with a plate of biscuits and sausage gravy. She set it down without ceremony. You should eat. William looked up. I'm not hungry. I didn't ask. Annie, wiping the next table, almost smiled. That was Rose's tone for men who had mistaken misery for an excuse to be difficult. William picked up the fork. He took one bite and stopped. Daniel would have loved this. He did, Rose said. Too much. Doctor told him to cut back on gravy. He said any doctor who declared war on gravy couldn't be trusted with a human life. Annie's hand froze on the table rag. For a second, Daniel was there again, not sick, not gone, just sitting in his booth, teasing Rose, stealing one more biscuit when he thought no one saw. The memory did not arrive gently. It struck. Rose saw Annie's face and looked away first. A mother's mercy sometimes meant pretending not to see. William set the fork down. I'm going to look for the letters today. Rose crossed her arms. At the house? Yes. And if your mother refuses? She will. That wasn't an answer. William looked toward the window, where the black Lincoln had been replaced by his own silver sedan. Then I'll search without her permission. Rose studied him. You do that often? Go against Mrs. Whitmore? No. At least you're honest. I'm late, he said. Honest is the least I can be. Rose did not soften, but she did not cut him either. Annie came over with the coffee pot. You really never got any of Daddy's letters? William shook his head. Not one. Maybe he wrote the wrong address. Rose answered before he could. Your father knew that address the way some men know scripture. William looked at her. Rose wiped a crumb from the table with her thumb. First year after he left, every time we drove near Atlanta, he'd get quiet. I didn't know why at first. Then I realized he was counting exits. He always knew which road led back. Why didn't he go? Annie asked. Rose turned to her. He did once. William sat straighter. Annie stared at her mother. You never told me that. There were many things I didn't tell you. That's starting to be a long list. Rose accepted that with a small nod. It is. William's voice came low. When? Before you were born, Rose said. I was pregnant, though we didn't know yet. Daniel drove to Atlanta because he said he couldn't let another Christmas pass without trying. He wore the brown jacket, took a card for William, sat outside the Whitmore gate for almost an hour. William closed his eyes. Rose continued. A guard came out, asked his name. Daniel said it. The guard went inside, came back, and said Mrs. Whitmore was not receiving visitors. She was home, William said. Rose looked at him. I know. He covered his mouth with one hand, but his eyes stayed open, fixed on nothing. Rose's voice quieted. He came back different that night, not crying. Daniel didn't cry easy, but something in him had gone still. He put the card in the box with the patch and said, That's enough doors for one lifetime. Annie sat down slowly across from William. What did the card say? She asked. Rose looked toward the back room. I don't know. He sealed it. William pushed the plate away and stood. I need to go. Rose nodded. Then go. Annie rose too. I'm coming. No, Rose said at once. Annie turned. Mama. No. That house hurt your father before you were born. I'm not sending you into it because Mr. Whitmore finally feels guilty. William did not defend himself. Annie's voice stayed calm, but her hands were shaking. Daddy's letters are in that house. If they're about him, they're about me too. Rose looked at her daughter, and for a moment she saw the child she had protected and the woman protection had not been able to prevent. That was the cruelest thing about motherhood. Every wall you built had a gate time would open. William said, I can bring them here. If you find them, Annie said. And if somebody doesn't decide what we're allowed to see, that landed where she meant it to land. Rose looked at William. She's not going alone with you. I wouldn't ask that. I'll go, Rose said. Annie blinked. Mama. Rose untied her apron. Marcus can handle lunch. Mrs. Hanley owes me from last Sunday. She can cover tables if it gets busy. From the kitchen pass, Marcus called. I heard that, and I do not agree to being abandoned with Mrs. Hanley. Rose shot back. You want to argue or keep your job? Yes, ma'am. Lunch is handled. Annie would have laughed on another day. They closed out the few tables, changed the sign to back at 2-0, and drove in William's car because Rose said her pickup would not make Atlanta without a prayer and a tow truck. Annie sat in the back with Daniel's patch in her purse and his jacket folded beside her. Rose sat up front, arms crossed, watching every turn as if the road itself might lie. For nearly half an hour, no one spoke. The Georgia countryside passed in fields, gas stations, church signs, pine stands, and old brick houses with porches wide enough for 3 generations of secrets. William drove without music. His phone rang twice. He ignored it both times. Annie finally broke the silence. What was he like? Before Rose's kitchen? Before all this, William kept his eyes on the road. Daniel? No, the other man with the silver eagle, Annie said. Yes, Daniel. Rose looked out the window, but Annie saw her mouth soften. William breathed out. He was braver than I was. Louder. Messier. Better with people. He could make a room forgive him before it knew it was mad. That sounds like him, Rose said. He hated neckties. Our father made us wear them to church. Daniel always loosened his before we got to the car. Mother would tell him he looked careless, and he'd say, No, ma'am, I look prepared to breathe. Annie smiled. William saw it in the rearview mirror and almost lost his next words. He taught me how to drive, he said. Badly. He said brakes were suggestions until they became emergencies. I put Mother's rose bushes in danger twice. Rose shook her head. Daniel and cars. Lord, he used to take blame for things I did, William said. Broken window, missing bourbon from father's cabinet, a dent in the mower. He'd say, Will's too nervous to be guilty. And they believed him. Were you? Annie asked. Guilty? Usually. She looked out the window. So he protected you? Yes. And when it mattered, you didn't protect him. The car went quiet. Rose turned slightly. Annie. No, William said. She's right. Annie expected him to sound offended. He sounded tired. After another 20 minutes, the Whitmore estate appeared beyond iron gates and live oaks. The house sat far back from the road, white columns rising over a wide porch, the lawn cut so evenly it looked less grown than arranged. Annie pressed her fingers around the strap of her purse. She had seen houses like this only from car windows or magazine pages left in waiting rooms. Rose looked at the gate. He came here with a Christmas card. William stopped at the speaker box and entered a code. The gates opened inward. Annie felt something in her stomach tighten. Daddy should have hated this place, Rose said softly. He tried not to. Inside, a man in a dark sweater opened the front door before they reached it. He was old, lean, and careful in his movements. His face changed when he saw William, then changed again when he saw Rose and Annie. Mr. William, he said. Samuel, William replied. Is my mother here? In the library, sir. The man's eyes moved to Rose. Something like recognition passed across his face, but not certainty. Rose noticed. Do I know you? No, ma'am, he said, but I believe I know who you are. Annie looked at him. William said, This is Mrs. Rose Brooks. And Annie. Samuel's gaze dropped for a second to Annie's purse, where the edge of Daniel's old handkerchief showed. Then his eyes grew wet. Miss Annie, he said quietly, your father had your picture in one of his letters. Rose went still. William turned. You saw the letters? Samuel looked toward the library door, then back. I kept what I could. Rose's voice dropped. What does that mean? Samuel seemed to age another 10 years before answering. It means some sins in a house don't belong only to the people who give orders. Some belong to the people who obey them. William stepped closer. Where are they? Samuel did not answer immediately. He looked at Annie first, and there was a tenderness there that almost frightened her. Your father wrote beautifully, he said. Not fancy, just true. Annie swallowed. Do you have them? Samuel nodded. From the library came Margaret's voice, controlled and cold. Samuel, do not. William turned toward the sound. Margaret stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame. Samuel lowered his eyes, but only for a second. When he lifted them, his voice was quiet and clear. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, I have served this family for 43 years. Today I believe I will serve the truth. Margaret's face tightened. William looked at Samuel. Take us to them. Samuel nodded toward the back hall. Annie reached for Rose's hand. Rose took it. Together they followed the old man deeper into the house Daniel had been told was no longer his, toward the letters he had sent into silence. Samuel led them through a hallway Annie had only seen in movies, the kind with dark wood, framed oil paintings, and rugs too old to trust beneath ordinary shoes. The house was quiet in a way Rose's kitchen never was. No radio, no clatter, no bell over the door. Just the soft hush of money that had learned how to keep secrets. Annie held her mother's hand tighter. Rose noticed but did not mention it. She was looking at the walls. Portraits of Whitmores stared down from carved frames. Men with square jaws, women in pearls. Children posed beside hunting dogs, all of them arranged as if blood were an accomplishment. Daniel was not there. Annie saw it before anyone said it. She searched each frame without meaning to, looking for her father's eyes, his mouth, the shape of his hands. Nothing. William saw her looking. He used to be in the front hall, he said. Rose kept walking. Used to be. The words were quiet, but they struck the wall harder than a shout. Margaret followed several steps behind them, her heels clicking against the floor. This is unnecessary, Samuel. The old man did not turn. Most things that should have been done long ago feel unnecessary to those who delayed them. Margaret inhaled sharply. William glanced at Samuel, almost surprised by the courage in the old man's back. They reached a narrow door near the end of the hall, past the dining room, past a sitting room where silver-framed photographs lined a piano. Samuel took a key ring from his pocket. His hands shook, but he found the right key. This was the linen room, he said. Later, Mrs. Whitmore had it used for storage. Margaret's voice came cold behind him. Samuel. He opened the door. The room smelled of cedar, dust, and old paper. Shelves ran along 3 walls, stacked with boxes labeled in neat handwriting. Christmas. Father's desk. Gala programs. Daniel. The last name was written in black marker, plain and small, as if even the box had been instructed not to draw attention. William stepped in first and stopped. There were 3 boxes with Daniel's name on them. Not 1, 3. For a moment, nobody spoke. Rose's hand slipped from Annie's. She walked to the nearest box and touched the label with 2 fingers. Her face did not collapse. Rose had mastered the art of not collapsing, but Annie could see the pain move through her shoulders. "You had boxes," Rose said. Margaret stood in the doorway. They were household items. Rose turned. His letters were household items? Margaret did not answer. William crouched and pulled the first box from the shelf. Dust lifted as he set it on the floor. Samuel handed him a pocket knife. William cut the old tape and opened the flaps. Inside were envelopes, dozens of them, some still sealed, some opened, some yellowed at the edges. Daniel's handwriting covered the fronts, slanted and familiar enough that Annie's chest tightened before she understood why. She had seen it on old grocery lists, on birthday cards, on notes taped to the refrigerator when he worked late. Annie knelt slowly. The first envelope on top was addressed to William Whitmore. Below the name was the Whitmore estate address. She looked up. He did right. William's jaw tightened. Yes. Annie lifted the envelope. It's sealed. William looked at Margaret. Margaret's face was pale, but she held her posture. "I did not read all of them." Rose laughed once under her breath. "That's your defense?" Margaret's eyes flashed. "You have no idea what it was like." Rose stood. "Then tell us. Tell us what it was like to sit in this house while my husband wrote to his brother and got buried alive by silence." Margaret's mouth opened, but no answer came. William took the envelope from Annie with care. "May I?" Annie hesitated. Then she nodded. He opened it with the pocket knife as if one rough move might wound the man who wrote it. Inside was a single page. William unfolded it. His eyes moved across the first line, and the color left his face. "What does it say?" Annie asked. He tried to read aloud, but the first words caught. He cleared his throat and began again. "Will, I don't know if this will reach you. Maybe it will. Maybe Mother will burn it before you see it. If she does, I guess that means she still thinks fire can clean up a family." Samuel bowed his head. William read on. "I'm not writing to ask for money. I know that's what they'll think. I don't need the house, and I don't need Father's office, and I don't need anybody calling me brave for leaving after making it impossible for me to stay. I'm writing because I miss my little brother. That's all. There's no dignified way to say it, so I won't dress it up. I miss you." William stopped. His hand trembled. Rose looked away. Annie pressed her fist against her mouth. Margaret whispered. He was angry. William looked up at her. He was lonely. He looked back at the letter. "Rose is pregnant. We found out last week. I'm terrified, which you'll enjoy hearing because you always liked when I admitted weakness. If it's a boy, I'll teach him to fish better than I taught you. If it's a girl, I'll be ruined completely. And I suspect I'll enjoy that too." Annie's eyes filled. Rose sat down on an old trunk, one hand over her stomach, as if the memory of carrying Annie had returned to her body. William continued, his voice breaking now and then but holding. "I want my child to know she has an uncle. I want to tell her stories about you. I want to say you were shy until someone needed you. Then you were the first one to show up. I hope that's still true. I hope the house didn't train that out of you." He could not continue. Annie reached for the letter, and William let her take it. She read the last lines herself, quietly. "I kept the eagle. I know you probably think that's childish. Maybe it is, but it reminds me that before we were Whitmores, before Mother taught us family meant obedience, we were just 2 boys promising not to get lost. I'm still here, Will. I don't know if that matters to you, but I'm still here." Annie lowered the paper. No one moved. Then she looked at William. "He gave you directions. He was right here." William closed his eyes. "I know." "No," Annie said, not loud, but sharp enough that he opened them. "You don't get to know it like we know it. He wrote you. He waited. He had me. He got sick. He died. And those letters were sitting in a linen room. Rose said, "Annie," but Annie kept looking at him. "You said you looked for him." "I did," William said quietly. "Not like I should have. That's not looking. That's checking if guilt is still comfortable." The words hit him. He did not defend himself. Margaret stepped into the room. "That is enough." Annie turned on her. "No, ma'am. Enough was 20 years ago." Margaret stared at her. Annie held up the letter. "He wanted me to know I had an uncle. Did you read that part before you put it in a box?" Margaret's lips trembled once. "I thought I was protecting him." "Who?" Rose asked. "Daniel, William, or yourself?" Margaret's answer was small. "The family." Rose stood then, all the gentleness gone from her face. "My husband was the family." That finally silenced Margaret. Samuel moved to the second box and opened it. More envelopes. Photographs. A tiny hospital bracelet taped to a card. Annie's name written in Daniel's hand. A picture of Annie as a baby, wrapped in a yellow blanket, her mouth open in a cry. William picked it up like it was sacred. "He sent this?" Rose's voice was low. "I remember that picture." Daniel said his brother needed to see what joy looked like after a door closed. William covered his eyes with one hand. Annie could not decide if she hated him or pitied him. Maybe both. Maybe grown-up pain was not clean enough to choose. Samuel took a smaller bundle from the bottom of the box. These were never mailed. Rose recognized the string. "Those were from the box at home?" Samuel shook his head. "No, ma'am. Mr. Daniel gave them to me." Rose froze. "You saw him?" Samuel's eyes closed briefly. "Once. At the gate. Christmas Eve." William looked up. Margaret turned toward Samuel as if the old man had betrayed her twice. Samuel continued. "He asked me to give them to Mr. William. I said I would try. Mrs. Whitmore found them before I could." Rose whispered. "He came." "Yes, ma'am," with a card and a small wrapped gift. William's voice was barely there. "For me?" Samuel nodded. "A watch strap, leather. He said yours was always cracking because you worried it between your fingers." William sat back against the shelf, struck by the accuracy of a memory he had thought no one loved enough to keep. Samuel opened the bundle and handed him the small package, still wrapped in brown paper. William did not open it. He held it against his chest. Margaret's face crumpled for a moment, but she forced it back into shape. "I did what I believed was necessary." William looked at her then, not as a son asking permission, but as a man seeing the cost of obedience. "Mother," he said, "your necessary things buried my brother." She recoiled. Rose gathered the baby photo, the first letter, and the silver eagle patch. She handed the letter to Annie. "This belongs to you too," she said. Annie took it, and something in her changed. Not healed, not settled, but named. William stood slowly. "I want to take all of these to the diner, with your permission." Rose looked at him. "Whose permission are you asking?" "Yours, Annie's, not hers." Margaret inhaled. Annie looked at the boxes. Her father's voice had been trapped here longer than she had been alive. Now the thought of leaving even one page behind felt wrong. "All of them," Annie said. William nodded. "All of them." Samuel wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I'll help carry them." Margaret stood in the doorway while they lifted the boxes, her face pale, her pearls resting against her throat like something too tight. As Annie passed her, Margaret spoke. "I did not know he had died." Annie stopped. She turned, holding the first letter against her chest. "No," Annie said. "You just made sure he knew you wouldn't come while he was alive." Margaret had no answer. Outside, the morning sun had risen higher over the Whitmore lawn. The house looked the same as it had when they arrived. White and grand and untouched. But Annie knew better now. Some houses did not fall when the truth came out. They simply stopped looking innocent. By the time they carried Daniel's boxes back into Rose's kitchen, the lunch crowd had come and gone without understanding why the diner had opened late, why Marcus looked nervous, or why Mrs. Hanley was serving coffee with the grim efficiency of a woman drafted into a war she had not been briefed on. Rose thanked everyone, paid Marcus for the full day, and flipped the sign to closed again. Mrs. Hanley stood near the register, purse on her arm, eyes fixed on the 3 boxes now sitting in the back booth. "You sure you don't need me to stay?" she asked. Rose shook her head. "You've done enough." Mrs. Hanley looked at Annie, then at William, then back at Rose. She was a churchwoman, which meant she knew when to offer help and when to carry gossip carefully disguised as prayer. But today, something in Rose's face warned her not to try either. All right, she said, but I'm 5 minutes away. When the door closed behind her, Rose locked it. The diner became still. William placed the last box on the booth seat. He had carried it himself, though Samuel had offered. Sweat had darkened the collar of his shirt. Dust from the Whitmore storage room clung to one sleeve. He looked less polished than he had the first time Annie saw him, and that made her trust him only a little more. Not much, just enough to notice. Samuel stayed near the counter, hat in both hands. He had come with them in William's car, sitting beside the driver, as if he had no right to take space in the back. Rose had told him twice he could sit at a table. He had refused both times. I can leave you folks to it, he said. Rose looked at him. You carried those letters for years? Samuel lowered his eyes. Some of them. Then you don't get to leave before we know what you carried. He nodded once and sat at the counter. Annie slid into the booth. Daniel's first letter lay in front of her, the one about Rose being pregnant, the one where he had written that he wanted his child to know she had an uncle. She had read the last line so many times in the car that the words felt pressed into her hand. I'm still here, Will. She looked at William across the table. He said he was still here. William did not answer. Rose opened the second box. We don't have to read them all today. Yes, we do, Annie said. Rose looked at her. Annie's voice softened, but did not bend. Mama. He waited all these years for somebody to hear him. Rose closed her eyes. William pulled out a chair but did not sit until Rose nodded toward it. It was a small thing, asking permission without saying it. And Rose noticed. She sat opposite him, Annie beside her. Samuel remained at the counter, still as a man in a pew. The first few letters were cautious. Daniel wrote like a man testing a bridge with his foot before trusting his weight to it. He asked William whether he still hated early meetings, whether their mother still kept white roses in the front parlor, whether the old oak behind the carriage house had finally been cut down. He did not ask why no one answered. Not at first. Then Annie found one written after she was born. The envelope had been opened. Margaret had read it. Annie held it up. This one. William's face tightened, but he nodded. She unfolded the letter. Will, Annie read, and her own voice sounded strange, carrying her father's words. She's here. Annie Rose Brooks. 7 pounds. 2 ounces. Louder than a fire alarm and somehow prettier than anything I've ever seen. Though Rose says newborns mostly look like old men who owe taxes. Rose covered her mouth. A laugh escaped her before the tears came. She wiped them fast, almost annoyed at herself. Annie kept reading. I wanted to call you from the hospital. I stood by the payphone for 10 minutes with your number in my hand. Then I thought about Mother answering, and I lost my nerve. That makes me a coward, I guess. You used to be the one scared of phones. Funny how life moves things around. William looked at the table. I wish you could hold her. I wish I could see whether you'd be awkward or whether she'd make you brave. I think she would. She made me brave in a way I didn't expect. Not loud brave, quiet brave. The kind where you get up because someone small is depending on you. Annie stopped reading for a second. Her eyes burned. Rose touched her knee under the table. Annie breathed in and finished. I'm sending a picture. If Mother sees it first, maybe she'll throw it away. Maybe she'll stare at it when nobody's looking. I don't know anymore. I do know this. My daughter is not a mistake. Rose is not a mistake. If you hear anything else, know it came from fear dressed up as family pride. William whispered, Daniel. Annie folded the letter carefully. He knew. Rose nodded. Your father always knew more than he said. William looked toward the window. Outside, a few people paused at the closed sign, peered in, then moved on. For once, Rose did not get up to explain. Samuel cleared his throat. Mrs. Whitmore saw that picture. All three looked at him. Samuel's hands tightened around his hat. The one of Miss Annie as a baby. She held it a long while. William's voice was rough. What did she do? She put it back in the envelope. And, Samuel looked at Annie, and told me no good would come from confusing a child. Annie's mouth tightened. Confusing me with what? A grandmother? Rose said. Annie, no, Mama. I want to know. What was I supposed to be confused about? Being loved? Samuel had no answer. William stood abruptly and walked to the counter, then stopped, hands on the edge. He was not leaving. He was trying to keep from breaking something. Rose watched him. Sit down, William. He did. She picked up another letter. This one was dated the year Annie turned 5. Daniel's handwriting looked more tired, but the words still carried him. Rose read this time. Will, Annie asked today why birds don't fall when they sleep on branches. I told her their feet know how to hold on even when the rest of them rests. Then she asked if people can learn that. I told her yes, but I'm not sure I believed myself. Rose paused. Her thumb moved over the page. She's got Rose's courage and my bad habit of asking questions at the worst possible time. She calls the diner our kingdom, which would make Mother choke on her tea. I hope it would make you laugh. William did laugh then, but it broke halfway. Rose continued. I still have the eagle. Annie saw it and asked if I was a soldier. I told her no. I almost told her about you. I wanted to. But how do I tell a child she has family who might not want her? How do I put that hunger in her before the world gets its turn? Annie looked down at her hands. Rose's voice faltered but held. So I told her it was from before. That was cowardly. Or maybe merciful. I don't know anymore. Parenthood is mostly making choices you pray won't become wounds later. Rose lowered the page. Annie did not speak. She understood, finally, not all the way, but enough. The secret had not been a wall built to keep her out. It had been Rose and Daniel standing with their backs against the door, trying to keep more pain from getting in. William said quietly, "He was protecting you." Annie looked at him. And who was protecting him? No one answered. The afternoon light shifted across the diner floor. Samuel poured himself water from behind the counter after asking Rose with a look. She nodded. They read for hours. Letters about Annie's first day of school. Letters about Daniel learning to make pancakes shaped like animals and producing what Annie had called sick clouds. Letters about medical bills after Daniel hurt his back. Letters about Rose buying the diner after Mabel retired. Letters that grew shorter around the edges as life became harder. Then William found one with no envelope, written in darker ink. He read the date and went still. What? Annie asked. William swallowed. This was after Father died. Margaret's husband, Daniel, and William's father. Rose sat back. Daniel heard about it in the paper. William unfolded the page. Will, I saw the obituary. I don't know what I'm supposed to feel. I keep waiting for grief, but mostly I feel like a man standing outside a house where music is playing for someone who won't let him in. Maybe that's grief too. William's voice thinned. I'm sorry you had to bury him without me. I'm sorry I wasn't there to stand beside you. Even if Mother would have had me removed before the first hymn. I would have stood outside if you wanted. I've gotten used to that. Rose looked at him. Keep reading. William forced himself on. I don't know if you ever read these. If you do, maybe you think I chose this distance. I chose Rose. I chose my daughter. I did not choose losing you. That part was chosen for me by people who believed love had a color line and family had a price tag. Annie closed her eyes. There it was. Not hidden, not softened. Her father had named it plainly. William looked at the last line. I forgive you for being young. I don't know if I forgive you for staying silent after you grew up. William set the letter down. For a while, he could not look at anyone. Rose's voice was not cruel when she spoke. That made it worse. He waited for you to become old enough to be brave. William nodded once. Samuel wiped his eyes. Annie pushed back from the booth and stood. She walked to the counter, poured herself water, drank half, then looked at William. What happens now? William lifted his head. Whatever you and your mother allow. That sounds careful. It is. Careful won't fix this. No, he said, but careless already broke it. Rose looked at him then, really looked. Not with trust, not yet, but with a measure of attention. William took a breath. I want a DNA test. The room shifted. Annie's face closed. There it is. Rose stood. You think she's lying? No. Then why? William turned to Annie. Because my mother will deny you until the day she dies if she can. Others in my family will too. Lawyers will ask questions. Reporters, if this gets out, will make your life ugly. A test won't tell you who your father was. You already know that. But it may force people like my mother to stop pretending. Annie looked at Rose. Rose did not answer for her. Annie said, I don't need a test to belong to my father. No, William said, you don't. And I don't need Whitmore blood to matter. No. Then say what you need it for. William met her eyes. To stand in front of my family and say Daniel's daughter is not a rumor. She is not charity. She is not a mistake. She is blood. And even that is less important than the fact that she was loved. Annie hated that the answer was good. Rose saw it on her face. We choose the lab, Rose said. William nodded. No press, Annie said. None. No lawyers talking to Mama like she's trying to steal something. I'll make sure of it. And I don't change my name. William's answer came at once. Never unless you choose to. Annie sat back down. She picked up one of Daniel's letters and folded it along the old crease. Fine, she said. But I want every letter copied first. One set for us. One for you. None for Mrs. Whitmore unless Mama says. William looked at Rose. Rose said. Annie spoke clearly. Yes, William said. She did. The bell above the door rang once. Everyone turned. Margaret stood outside the glass, not entering, one hand resting against the door frame. She must have been there long enough to see the boxes open, the letters spread across the booth, Daniel's life laid out in ink. For a moment, she looked less like a matriarch and more like an old woman staring through a window at a family she had helped create by refusing to accept it. Annie held her gaze through the glass. Then she reached across the table and placed Daniel's letter in front of William. Read the rest, she said. William looked at Margaret, then down at his brother's handwriting. And this time, he chose the letter. Margaret did not come in. She stood outside Rose's kitchen with one hand on the doorframe, watching William read Daniel's letters under the yellow diner lights. The glass between them was thin enough for seeing and too thick for belonging. For once, she seemed to understand the difference. William read until his voice gave out. Rose made another pot of coffee. Annie gathered the letters into careful piles by year. Samuel wrote dates on paper slips and placed them between stacks with the patience of a man doing penance, one small motion at a time. Nobody invited Margaret inside. Nobody told her to leave. That was its own kind of judgment. Near dusk, Rose found the last envelope. It had not been in the first two boxes. It was tucked inside the pocket of Daniel's old jacket. The same jacket Annie had carried to the Whitmore house and brought back across her lap. Rose's hand brushed the pocket by accident when she lifted it from the booth. Something stiff crackled under her fingers. She froze. Annie looked up. Mama? Rose reached into the inside pocket and pulled out a sealed envelope, yellowed but clean. Daniel's handwriting sat across the front. For Rose, no one moved. William set down the letter he had been holding. Samuel removed his glasses and looked away. Annie stared at the envelope like it had begun to breathe. Rose sat slowly. I didn't know this was here, she said. Her voice sounded younger than it had all day. Annie slid into the booth beside her. You don't have to open it now. Rose gave a small nod, but her fingers were already under the flap. If I wait, I'll be afraid of it. The paper opened with a soft tear. Rose unfolded the letter. For a moment, she only looked at the handwriting. Daniel's hand had changed near the end. The words were still clear, but the lines wavered a little, as if even the ink had been tired. Rose began to read silently. Annie watched her mother's face. It changed in small pieces. First recognition, then pain, then something Annie could not name because she had never seen it there before, not since Daniel died. It looked like being held. Rose pressed the letter to her chest. William spoke softly. Rose? She shook her head once, not to stop him, but to steady herself. Then she lowered the letter and read aloud. Rosie, if you found this, it means I put it somewhere clever or somewhere foolish. You always said those were the same place when it came to me. Rose laughed through her nose and wiped her cheek. Annie reached for her hand. Rose continued. I don't know how much time I have, and I don't want to waste any of it pretending I am braver than I am. I am scared. Not of dying, exactly. I've made my peace with the Lord in the messy way I make peace with most things. I am scared of leaving you with bills, with the diner, with our daughter asking questions I should have answered myself. Annie's grip tightened. I should have told Annie more. I know that. Every year I promised myself I would, and every year I looked at her face and thought, not yet. Let her be a child one more summer. Let her go to school without carrying my old house on her back. Let her know herself before she knows who rejected her. Rose stopped. Annie took the letter gently. Can I? Rose nodded. Annie read the next part, and the sound of her father's words in her own voice nearly broke her. If she is angry with me one day, Let her be. Don't soften it for me. I earned some of that anger. A father's love does not make his silence harmless. Tell her I was proud of her before she knew how to stand. Tell her I saw you in her every time she refused to lower her eyes. Tell her the Whitmore name can open doors, but her mother's name taught her how to walk through any room with her spine straight. Annie stopped reading. She looked at Rose, eyes wet. He wrote that? Rose nodded, unable to speak. William looked down at the tabletop. Annie read on. About William. I don't know what to say that won't sound smaller than what I feel. I loved my brother. I was angry with him. Some days I forgave him before breakfast and hated him again by supper. That is the truth of being hurt by someone you still love. If he ever finds you, Rosie, don't let him buy his way past what happened. But don't let my anger be the only thing he inherits either. William covered his eyes. Outside the glass, Margaret stood still. Rose took the letter back. Her voice shook now, but she finished. And if my mother ever sees Annie, I hope she has enough years left to regret what pride cost her. I do not say that cruelly. Regret may be the last mercy God gives people who confused control with love. Samuel bowed his head. Rose read the final lines. I kept the eagle because I could not stop being a brother. I gave it to you because I did not want Annie to think I belonged to people who threw me away. I belong to you. I belong to her. And if the day comes when that patch brings the past to your door, you decide how wide to open it. You kept me alive in the years after I lost my name. Don't let anybody make you feel small in the house we built. Rose lowered the letter. No one spoke. The radio behind the counter had gone to static sometime during the reading. Marcus would have reached over and fixed it on a normal day. No one moved now. Then Annie stood. She walked to the front door and unlocked it. Rose looked up. Annie. Annie opened the door. Margaret stood outside, her eyes fixed on the letter in Rose's hand. You heard? Annie asked. Margaret's lips moved, but nothing came. Annie stepped aside. Then come in or leave, but don't stand there like somebody else locked you out. Margaret looked at Rose. Rose did not invite her. She did not refuse her either. After a long moment, Margaret stepped into the diner. The bell above the door rang softly. It was such a small sound for a woman crossing a line she had drawn 20 years ago. Margaret walked toward the booth, slower than before. There was no command in her now, no quick correction ready on her tongue. She looked at the boxes, at the letters, at Daniel's jacket, then at the silver eagle patch lying near Annie's hand. May I see it? She asked. Rose's face closed. Annie picked up the patch. Why? Margaret looked at her. Because I remember sewing the first loose thread on Daniel's jacket when he was 16. He told me not to fuss. I fussed anyway. William stared at his mother. It was the first tender thing she had said about Daniel all day. Annie did not hand her the patch yet. You remember that, but you don't remember he was your son when he married my mother? Margaret flinched. Rose said quietly, Annie. No, Mama. I'm not being rude. I'm asking. Margaret looked at Annie. Really looked. Not at her apron, not at her skin as a problem to manage, not at her as proof, threat, or scandal. At her. I remembered, Margaret said. That was the trouble. Annie's anger paused, not gone but listening. Margaret sat at the edge of the nearest chair without being offered one. If I had made him a stranger, it would have been easier. I tried. I told myself he was reckless, ungrateful, misled. I told myself a mother had a duty to protect the family from choices that would destroy it. Rose's voice was flat. You mean, me? Margaret nodded once. It cost her. Yes, William said. Mother. She lifted a hand. Let me say it badly if I must. I have said nothing well for years. That silenced him. Margaret turned to Rose. I looked at you and saw everything I had been taught to fear. Not because of who you were. Because of what people would say. Because of what rooms would close to us. Because I had lived so long inside approval that I mistook it for air. Rose watched her, unmoved. And Daniel paid for your breathing. Yes, Margaret whispered. Annie's fingers tightened around the patch. Margaret looked at her. When Samuel brought the first letter, I told myself I was sparing William. He was young. He had just begun taking responsibility in the company. He worshipped Daniel. And I thought if I let that door open, I would lose both sons. William's voice came low. So you chose which one to lose? Margaret closed her eyes. I told myself Daniel had already chosen. Rose leaned back. That lie served you well. It did, Margaret said. For a while, Annie looked at the boxes. For his whole life, Margaret bowed her head. There was no answer to that. After a moment, Rose slid Daniel's final letter across the table, but kept her fingers on it. You don't get to keep this. Margaret looked at her. I understand. You can read it here. Margaret nodded. Rose let go. Margaret touched the paper as if it might burn her. She read slowly. Her face remained controlled for the first few lines. Then her mouth tightened. By the time she reached the words about regret, her hand was shaking. She did not cry loudly. Margaret Whitmore would not know how. Tears simply gathered and fell with no permission from the rest of her face. When she finished, she folded the letter along the same crease Daniel had made and set it down. He thought I had years, she said. Rose did not soften. He hoped you did. Margaret looked at Annie. What did he tell you about me? Annie sat across from her. Nothing. That answer hurt more than accusation. Margaret accepted it with a small nod. Perhaps I deserved that. Maybe, Annie said. But I didn't. I deserved to know I had a grandmother, even if she didn't want me. Rose inhaled sharply. Margaret's face broke then, just for a second. I did not know you. You could have, Annie said. William looked away. Samuel stood and moved behind the counter without asking. He poured water into 4 glasses because it was something to do when words had cut too deep. Margaret looked at the glass he set before her. Thank you, Samuel. He nodded, but his face stayed guarded. William picked up one of the open letters. There will be a DNA test. Margaret stiffened. Rose saw it. That bothers you? It concerns me. Annie gave a dry little laugh. There she is. Margaret turned to her. You misunderstand me. I don't think I do. Margaret held her gaze. A test will not be private once lawyers know, once trustees know, once the family knows. There will be questions about inheritance, legitimacy, intentions. People will be unkind. Rose said, people already were. Yes, Margaret said, and I was one of them. That admission changed the air again. Not enough to forgive, enough to notice. William studied his mother. Are you telling us not to take the test? Margaret looked at the 2 silver eagle patches. No. The word surprised everyone. She drew a breath. I am telling you that once you do, the Whitmore family will not respond with grace. They will protect money first, reputation second, and feelings only if there is time. I know because I taught them, Rose said. Then unteach them. Margaret looked at her. Rose's voice was steady. If you have regret, use it. Don't sit in it like a church pew and call that repentance. Annie glanced at her mother, struck by the force in the words. Margaret nodded slowly. What do you want from me? Rose answered at once. Nothing bought. Annie said, nothing polished. William said, the truth. Samuel, from the counter, added quietly, and the rest of the letters, ma'am, if there are more. Margaret looked at him. Then she looked at William. There is one more place, she said. William went still. Where? Margaret's eyes moved to the photograph of Daniel on the table. Your father's study, she said. The bottom drawer. I kept the last things there. Rose's jaw tightened. Last things? Margaret's voice dropped. A Christmas card. A baby picture. And a letter Daniel wrote to me. The room held its breath. Annie looked at Rose, then at William. William stood. No more locked drawers, he said. Margaret nodded, and this time she did not argue. But as they prepared to leave for the Whitmore house again, Annie picked up Daniel's final letter and slid it into her purse. Rose noticed. You keeping that one? Annie looked toward the window, where evening had begun turning the street gold. For now, she said. Daddy said Mama decides how wide to open the door. She looked at William, then at Margaret. I'm not sure yet who gets a key. They returned to the Whitmore estate after sunset. This time, Annie did not stare at the gates with the same fear. The house still looked too large, too white, too certain of itself. But something had changed. It was no longer a place from a story her mother had hidden from her. It was a place that had taken things from her father and kept them in drawers. That made it less grand. It made it searchable. Margaret led them through the front hall without speaking. Samuel walked a few steps behind, carrying one of Daniel's letters in a folder as if it were evidence in court. William stayed near Annie and Rose, not guiding them, not rushing them, just staying close enough to make clear whose side he had chosen. Annie looked at the walls again. Still no Daniel. She stopped under a portrait of a man with gray eyes and a stern mouth. "Is that your father?" William looked up. "Yes." Rose's face went still. Margaret paused near the staircase. "Henry Whitmore." Annie studied the portrait. "Did he know about my father? About Mama?" Margaret's jaw tightened. He knew Daniel had become difficult. Rose gave a short laugh. "Difficult. That's a clean word for loving a black woman against orders." Margaret did not answer. William looked at the portrait for a long moment. Father never yelled. That was his talent. He could make a room obey him by lowering his voice. Daniel hated that, Margaret said before she could stop herself. Everyone turned to her. She looked irritated at having given away a memory. He did. He said silence was just shouting with better manners. Annie looked at William. For the first time that night, he smiled with real pain in it. He did say that. Margaret turned away. "The study is this way." Henry Whitmore's study sat at the back of the house, behind double doors that opened into dark shelves, leather chairs, and a desk large enough to make a man feel important before he said a word. The room smelled of old tobacco and furniture polish. A brass lamp glowed on the desk, though no one had been working there. Margaret stood just inside the door, her hands folded. "I have not opened that drawer in years," she said. Rose's voice was flat. "That's supposed to comfort us?" "No." "Good." William walked to the desk. "Which drawer?" "Bottom right." He crouched, pulled the brass handle. Locked. Samuel stepped forward without being asked and removed a key from his ring. Margaret looked at him. "You had a key?" "I had many keys, ma'am. That was my job." He unlocked the drawer. William pulled it open. Inside were 3 items, placed with the careful order of a person who wanted to pretend storage was not the same as burial. A small Christmas card, a baby photograph in a yellowed envelope, and a letter addressed to Margaret Whitmore. Rose's hand went to her throat. Annie saw the baby photograph first. She knew before anyone touched it. "That's me," she said. William lifted it. In the picture, Annie was a few months old, wrapped in a yellow blanket, sleeping with one fist near her mouth. On the back, Daniel had written, "Annie Rose. She already looks like she has opinions." Rose made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost grief. He loved that picture. Margaret stared at it. "I know." Annie looked up sharply. "You looked at it?" Margaret nodded. "And you still kept it from him?" Annie asked, pointing to William. Margaret did not defend herself. "Yes." The answer was so plain it left no place for Annie's anger to land cleanly. She hated that. She wanted Margaret to argue so she could fight back. Instead, the old woman stood there with the truth in her mouth and no shelter over it. William picked up the Christmas card next. The envelope was never sealed. Daniel must have planned to hand it over. On the front was a painted church in snow, the kind sold in drugstores every December. Inside, in Daniel's handwriting, were only 3 lines. "Will, I drove all this way and may still lose my nerve. If I don't see you tonight, Merry Christmas. If I do, pretend you missed me less than I missed you. I'll know you're lying." William sat down in his father's chair. No one spoke while he read it twice. Then a third time, Rose looked toward the window. "He came home with that card in his coat," said the gate was closed. Samuel's voice was low. "I told him Mrs. Whitmore was not receiving visitors." William looked at him. Samuel's eyes were wet. "I was told to say it, sir. That does not make it less mine." Rose looked at Samuel, and for the first time her anger at him softened into something more complicated. "Did he say anything?" Samuel nodded. "He asked if Mr. William was well. I said yes. He smiled then, but not in a happy way. He gave me the card and the gift, and told me if I had a chance, I should pass them along. Then he said, 'Tell my brother eagles are stubborn birds.'" William bent forward, the card held between both hands. Annie stood beside Rose, holding the baby picture. Her father had driven to this house. He had stood near these gates. He had been turned away with a card in his coat and a gift in his hand. Then he had gone home and still taught his daughter not to hate people by name. That seemed impossible now. Margaret reached for the final letter, then stopped. Rose noticed. "Afraid of his handwriting?" Margaret's voice was quiet. "Yes." No one expected that. Margaret picked up the letter and sat in the chair across from the desk, not at the desk itself. She looked suddenly smaller in the room her husband had once ruled. "This was the only letter he wrote to me after he left," she said. William looked up. "You read it?" "Many times." "Why didn't you answer?" Margaret looked at the folded paper. "Because every answer I knew how to give still required him to apologize." Rose's mouth tightened. Margaret unfolded the letter. Her hands shook, but she read aloud. "Mother, Rose says I should not write when I'm angry because I sharpen sentences like knives. She is right. So I waited 3 days. I am still angry, but the blade is cleaner now." A faint sound left Rose. "That man," Margaret continued. "I know what you think I chose. You think I chose a woman over family. You think I chose hardship over responsibility. You think I chose embarrassment over order. Maybe from where you sit, that is what it looks like. From where I stand, I chose not to let the people who raised me decide which parts of my heart were respectable." William closed his eyes. "I love Rose, not as rebellion, not as a phase, not as punishment for you. I love her because she tells the truth when it would be easier not to. I love her because she knows the price of dignity and pays it without sending anyone else the bill. I love her because when I am with her, I do not feel like a son being measured. I feel like a man being known." Rose turned away. Annie slipped her hand into her mother's. Margaret read slower now. "You called her practical, and you were right. She is practical enough to know your world will not forgive her for being loved by me. She is practical enough to be afraid, but she is also brave enough not to sell me back to you. I wish you had met that bravery with something better than money." Margaret's voice broke on the last word, but she forced herself to finish. "If I have a child one day, I will not teach that child to hate you. That would still make you too large in my house. But I will not teach that child to beg for you either. If you want to be family, you will have to come as family, not as a queen inspecting damage." Annie looked at Margaret. The old woman's tears fell freely now, though she made no sound. The final paragraph was short. "I am your son. That is not something you can revoke. But I am Rose's husband by choice, and if you make me choose again, I will choose her again. I hope one day you understand that love is not disobedience. Sometimes it is the first honest thing a person ever does." Margaret lowered the letter. For a long time, the study remained silent. Then Rose said, "He should have said that to your face." Margaret nodded. "Yes, he probably tried." Another nod, smaller. "Yes." Annie stepped forward with the baby picture. "Did you ever show this to anyone?" Margaret shook her head. "Why keep it?" Margaret looked at the sleeping baby in Annie's hand. "Because I could not throw it away." "That's not love," Annie said. "No," Margaret answered. "It is not. It is what cowardice does when it wants to pretend it has a heart." William looked at his mother then, startled by the honesty. Rose studied her too, but offered no comfort. Annie placed the baby photograph on the desk beside Daniel's letter. "My father gave you chances." "Yes," Margaret said. "You wasted them." "Yes. Now what are you going to do with this one?" Margaret looked at her granddaughter. The word was not spoken, but it sat there between them with Daniel's eyes. "I don't know how to be what you need," Margaret said. Annie's answer came fast. "Then start by not deciding what I need." Rose squeezed her hand. William stood slowly. "The test will be done tomorrow." Quietly. "After that, I'm calling the family." Margaret looked alarmed. "William." "No," he said. "No more drawers, no more boxes, no more locked rooms." Daniel had a daughter. Rose was his wife. "This family will hear it from me before they hear it from lawyers or gossip." Margaret looked at Rose. "Will you allow that?" Rose lifted her chin. "You're asking now?" "I am." Rose thought for a moment. "Daniel's name gets spoken cleanly. Annie doesn't get paraded. And nobody calls this charity." William said, "Agreed." Annie added, "And I keep being Annie Brooks." William nodded. "Always." Margaret looked at her. "May I ask one thing?" Annie waited. "When the test confirms what we already know, may I have a copy of the baby picture?" Rose's face hardened. Margaret raised a hand slightly. "Not the original. I know I have no right." Annie looked down at the photo. Baby Annie, asleep, unaware of gates, letters, pride, race, money, names, just loved. "We'll see," she said. Margaret accepted it. Samuel, who had been quiet near the door, cleared his throat. "There is one more thing." William turned. "What?" Samuel looked at the wall behind Henry Whitmore's desk. Mr. Daniel's portrait. It was removed from the front hall after he left. Mr. Henry ordered it stored. Margaret closed her eyes. William's voice came hard. "Where is it?" Samuel said, "Attic room above the east wing." Annie looked at Rose. Rose looked at William. No one had to say what came next. They climbed the back stairs together. The attic smelled of heat, dust, and old wood. Samuel pulled a cord, and a bar of bulb flickered on. Under a canvas sheet near the far wall stood a large frame. William lifted the sheet. Daniel looked back at them, younger, cleaner, wearing a navy blazer he probably hated. His smile was restrained for the portrait, but it had not been defeated yet. Rose touched the edge of the frame. "Hello, Daniel." Annie stood beside her mother, seeing the father she knew and the son they had erased in the same face. William stared at the portrait. Then he looked at Margaret. "Tomorrow," he said, "this goes back in the front hall." Margaret did not argue. She only looked at Daniel's painted face and whispered something Annie barely heard. "My son." For Annie, it was not enough. But for the first time, it was not nothing. The next morning, the DNA clinic opened at 9. But Annie was awake before 5. She lay in the small bed in the back room of Rose's kitchen and listened to her mother move around in the diner. Cabinets opened. The coffee maker clicked. A spoon touched a mug. Rose was trying to be quiet and failing in all the familiar ways that had filled Annie's childhood. On any other morning, the sounds would have comforted her. That morning, they sounded like a countdown. Annie turned on her side and looked at Daniel's brown jacket hanging from the chair. The silver eagle patch was folded in a handkerchief on the dresser beside it. Last night, she had read 3 more of his letters before Rose made her stop. One of them described Annie's first school play, where she forgot her line and waved at Daniel from the stage instead. He had written to William, "She looked right at me like I was the whole audience. I hope every child gets at least one person in the room who makes them feel that safe." Annie had cried over that line after everyone else went to bed. Now she got up, washed her face, dressed in jeans and a clean blouse, and carried the patch into the diner. Rose stood behind the counter pouring coffee into 2 mugs. "You sleep?" Rose asked. "No. Me neither." They did not pretend. Annie sat at the counter. "Do we have to do this?" Rose set a mug in front of her. "No." Annie looked up. Rose leaned her hands on the counter. "You do not owe that family your blood in a tube. You do not owe William proof. You do not owe Margaret peace. If you say no, we open this diner and make biscuits like any other day. But it won't be any other day." "No," Rose said. "It won't." Annie turned the patch in her fingers. "Daddy already knew who I was." "Yes." "You know." "Yes." "Then why does a paper matter?" Rose was quiet for a moment. Outside, the street lights still burned against a pale gray sky. Because some people won't hear truth unless it comes stamped and filed. That doesn't make the truth theirs. It just leaves them fewer places to hide. At 8:15, William arrived alone. He came through the front door without the coat, without Margaret, without the expensive certainty that had filled him 2 days before. He wore a blue shirt, sleeves buttoned at the wrist, and carried a plain folder under one arm. Rose looked past him. "Where's your mother?" "At the house." "Did she choose that?" "I chose it." Annie watched him. "Why?" William stood near the first table, not moving farther in. "Because today is not about her." Rose nodded once. "That's the first sensible thing you've said this morning. It's early. Plenty of time to ruin it." He almost smiled. Then looked at Annie. "The clinic is private. The lab is in Atlanta, certified. No press. No family attorneys present. I put that in writing." He handed Rose the folder. She read the page slowly. Annie saw her mother checking every line, not because she trusted legal language, but because distrust had kept them alive more than once. Rose handed it back. "Fine." William did not look relieved. "Annie, if you change your mind in the parking lot, we leave." She searched his face for pressure. She found fear instead. "Are you afraid it won't match?" she asked. "No," he said. "I'm afraid it will." That answer stayed with them all the way to the clinic. The building was small, brick, and clean, tucked beside a dental office and a tax service. A woman at the front desk greeted them in a calm voice and called them by appointment number instead of name, which Annie appreciated. The nurse explained the cheek swab. It took less than 5 minutes. Less than 5 minutes to confirm what had taken a lifetime to hide. When it was done, Annie stepped outside before Rose and William. The parking lot smelled of wet asphalt and pine. She stood beside a crepe myrtle tree and pressed her hands into her pockets. William came out last. "How long?" Rose asked. "Expedited results by tomorrow evening," he said. "Maybe sooner." Annie let out a dry laugh. "Funny. They can find out a family in a day, but it took you 20 years. William took the blow without blinking. "Yes." She looked away. "I didn't mean—" "You did." Annie hated that he was right. Rose touched her daughter's shoulder. "Words said in pain still belong to us." "I know," Annie said. William looked at Rose. "Daniel used to say that?" "No," Rose said. "That one's mine." They drove back in silence until William turned not toward the diner, but toward the older road by the cemetery. Rose noticed first. "Where are you going?" William slowed the car. "May I see where he's buried?" Annie's first instinct was no. The word rose fast and hot. Daniel's grave was theirs. It was the place she and Rose brought flowers. The place Rose spoke when the bills got bad. The place Annie sat after graduation because her father had not been there to see her walk. But then she thought of the Christmas card at the gate. Daniel turned away from his own brother, and something in her anger shifted. "He's at Bell Creek Cemetery," she said. "Back row, near the dogwood." William nodded. "Thank you." Bell Creek Cemetery sat behind a white Baptist church with a steeple that needed painting. The graves were uneven, some old enough for names to blur, some fresh with plastic flowers bright against red Georgia clay. Rose led the way without asking if anyone was ready. Daniel's headstone was simple. Daniel Brooks, beloved husband and father, a man who chose love. Annie watched William read it. He stood very still. Rose placed a hand on the stone. "Morning, Daniel." Annie swallowed. That was what Rose always said, whether it was morning or not. William took one step closer, then stopped. "May I?" Rose looked at Annie. Annie looked at the grave. "Don't make a speech." "I won't." William crouched in front of the stone. He rested one hand on his knee, the other hanging uselessly at his side. For a long time, he said nothing. Then his voice came low. "Danny." Rose closed her eyes. Annie had never heard anyone call her father that. William breathed in hard. "I don't know what I'm allowed to say to you. I don't know if saying sorry to a stone is decent or cowardly. Maybe both." A crow called somewhere near the church roof. William continued. "I got your letters. Not when I should have. Not when you needed me. I got them after your daughter had to shame me into believing the truth at a diner table." Annie looked down. "I laughed at her," William said. "God help me, Daniel. I laughed at your girl. She stood there telling the truth, and I treated her like she was reaching for something above her. You would have hated me for that." Rose's mouth trembled. William put his hand over his eyes. "I'm glad you weren't there to see it. I'm sorry you weren't there to correct me." The words broke at the end. Annie felt her anger move again, not gone, not softened into forgiveness, but no longer clean. She had wanted him to hurt. Now he did, and it did not repair anything. William looked at the headstone. "You protected me when we were boys. You took blame that was mine. You waited for me to become brave. I didn't. Not soon enough." He reached into his shirt pocket and took out the small Christmas card Daniel had tried to deliver years before. Rose inhaled sharply. William looked back. "I won't leave it if you don't want me to." Rose hesitated. Then she nodded. William placed the card at the base of the stone, weighted by a small rock. "I came late," he said. "I know that. I can't ask you to hear me, but I'm here now, and I will not let them erase you again." Annie's eyes burned. For a moment, all she could see was her father sitting at the back table, cough held in his chest, smiling at her over a plate of pancakes, shaped like nothing. She thought of his letter. "I want my child to know she has an uncle." She stepped beside William. "He used to call me Little Bird," she said. William looked up at her. Annie kept her eyes on the stone. "I thought it was because I talked too much." A small laugh escaped Rose. William's face changed. "He called me little brother until I was 30. That sounds annoying." "It was," William said. "I miss it." Annie nodded, not trusting herself with more. Then William stood, but slowly, like leaving required permission from the ground. At the edge of the cemetery, Margaret was waiting. None of them had seen her arrive. Her car sat near the church, engine off. She stood by the gate in a dark dress, one hand resting on the iron fence. looking toward Daniel's grave but not coming closer. Rose saw her and stiffened. Annie did too. William's face hardened. I told her not to come. Margaret did not move. For once, she did not cross the line. Annie looked at the old woman, then at Daniel's grave. She can stand there. Rose turned to her. Annie wiped her cheek. Daddy stood outside their gate once. William closed his eyes. Margaret remained by the cemetery entrance, outside the row of family grief, separated by 30 yards, a fence, and the weight of what she had done. When they walked back to the car, she spoke only once. "May I come another day?" she asked. Rose looked at her for a long time. "Not with us." Margaret nodded. "I understand." Annie expected her to argue. She did not. That almost made it worse. By late afternoon, they returned to Rose's kitchen. William stayed for coffee but did not sit in Daniel's booth until Annie nodded toward it. He understood the permission and took it carefully. Just before closing, his phone rang. He looked at the screen, then at Rose and Annie. "The lab," he said. The diner went still. Annie's heart began to pound so hard she felt it in her throat. William answered, listened, and did not speak for nearly a minute. Then he lowered the phone. Rose gripped the counter. Annie could not move. William looked at her with eyes full of grief, relief, and something that frightened her because it looked like love arriving before anyone had agreed to it. "It's confirmed," he said. "You're Daniel's daughter." Annie's first thought was absurd. "I already was." Her second thought broke her. "Daddy, they know now." Rose came around the counter and held her before the tears reached her chin. William stood by the booth, hands at his sides, not stepping in, not claiming the moment. For once, he knew the difference between being present and taking space. Outside, evening settled over Bell Creek. Inside, Daniel's letters lay stacked on the table, and the silver eagle patch rested beside them. The truth had finally found paper, but Annie understood, even through her tears, that paper was only the beginning. William did not call the family that night. He wanted to. Annie could see it in the way he looked at his phone every few minutes, thumb resting near the screen, jaw tight, shoulders carrying a decision that had already been made but not yet spoken. Rose saw it too. She gave him coffee, then took the cup away when it went cold, then gave him another without comment. Annie sat in Daniel's booth with the lab report folded in front of her. Her name was printed there. Daniel's name was not fully, because the test had been done through William's sample. The language was clinical, bloodless, full of percentages and probability. But at the bottom it said what everyone in that diner already knew. Biological relationship confirmed. Annie touched the paper once, then drew her hand back. Rose sat beside her. "You all right?" "No." Rose nodded. "That's fair. I thought I'd feel something clearer. Clear is not what family does best." Annie almost smiled, but it faded. "He was my father before this." "Yes, he was. So why does this hurt?" Rose reached over and smoothed the edge of the report. "Because now the people who denied him don't get to pretend." And pretending was part of what kept the wound quiet. William heard that from across the room. He stood near the counter, one hand in his pocket, looking down at the floor. "I'm calling them tomorrow morning." Rose looked up. "Them?" "My cousins, the board members who are family, the trustees, my mother's sister. Everyone who will try to turn this into a legal problem before they admit it's a moral one." Annie leaned back in the booth. "Sounds like a crowd." "It is." "Are they like Margaret?" William took a moment. "Some are worse because they smile more." Rose made a small sound. "At least you know your people. I should have known them sooner." Annie looked through the window. Main Street had gone quiet. Bell Creek rolled up early most nights, except for the gas station and the bar where men with old regrets drank under neon. Rose's kitchen was the only warm square of light left on the block. "What happens after you call them?" Annie asked. "They'll ask for the report." "No." William looked at her. Annie tapped the folded paper. "This isn't going to get passed around like a menu." He nodded. "Then they can see a certified copy when your mother permits it." Rose watched him carefully. "You're learning." "Slowly. That's usually how men do it." For the first time all day, Annie laughed. It was brief, and it surprised her enough that she put her hand over her mouth. Rose smiled at the sound, but her eyes went wet right after. Joy had become dangerous since Daniel died. It arrived without warning and left fingerprints. William looked at Annie, then away, giving the moment room. The bell above the door rang. Margaret stepped in. No one had told her to come. No one looked surprised that she had. She wore a gray coat and no pearls this time. Without them, her neck looked fragile. She carried a small white envelope in both hands. Rose stood. Annie did not. William's face tightened. "Mother, tonight is not." "I know," Margaret said. That stopped him. Margaret Whitmore did not often admit timing belonged to anyone else. She stood near the door, not entering fully. "Samuel told me the result came." Rose crossed her arms. "Samuel talks too much for a man who spent years saying too little. He said only that it was confirmed." Margaret looked at Annie. "May I ask if that is true?" Annie stared at her. "Would you believe me?" Margaret lowered her eyes. "I would like to. That isn't what I asked." "No," Margaret said. "It isn't." William moved toward her, but Rose shook her head once. "Let it stand." Margaret lifted the envelope. "This was in my room. I found it after I came back from the cemetery." William's expression changed. "Another letter?" "No, a photograph." She walked to the counter and placed the envelope there, then stepped back as if it did not belong to her once it touched the wood. Rose did not move. Annie did. She took the envelope, opened it, and pulled out an old photograph. Daniel was maybe 16, standing beside a much younger William near a lake. Both boys were sunburned. Daniel had one arm hooked around William's neck, pulling him into the frame. William looked annoyed and happy. On Daniel's denim jacket, half hidden near the inside seam, was the silver eagle patch. Annie's chest tightened. She turned the photo over. In faded ink, someone had written, "The boys. Lake Sinclair. Summer." Margaret spoke from near the door. "I thought you should have it." Annie looked at her. "Why?" Margaret's answer came slowly. "Because I kept too many things that should have been given." Rose said nothing, but her face shifted. Annie looked at the photograph again. "He looks happy." "He was," William said quietly. "That day, he pushed me off a dock because I told him I was too old to be shoved around. Then he jumped in after me because he remembered I wasn't a strong swimmer." "You couldn't swim?" "I could swim badly." Annie glanced at him. "He saved you?" "Many times." The words were simple, but the room heard what sat beneath them. Margaret's hand tightened on the strap of her purse. "He was always watching after you." William turned toward her. "And when he needed someone to watch after him?" Margaret took the blow. "I know." "No, Mother. I don't think you do." "William," Rose said. He looked at her, surprised. Rose's voice stayed even. "Tomorrow is for your family table. Tonight is not for putting all the guilt in one chair and pretending that solves it." William inhaled, then nodded. "You're right." Margaret looked at Rose with something close to gratitude, and Rose's face immediately warned her not to mistake it for forgiveness. Annie slid the photograph back into the envelope. "Thank you." Margaret's eyes lifted. "You're welcome." It was too polite for what they were to each other, but it was better than nothing. The next morning, William rented the private room at the Bell Creek Community Bank because Rose refused to go back to the Whitmore estate until Daniel's portrait was in the front hall. William did not argue. By 9, the room held a long oak table, a coffee urn, a plate of untouched pastries, and 12 Whitmores who looked as if they had been summoned to a lawsuit. Annie sat between Rose and William. She wore a navy dress Rose had ironed twice. Her hair was pulled back. Daniel's silver eagle patch rested in her purse, wrapped in the handkerchief. She did not want to wear it. Not there. Not for them. Margaret sat across the table, silent. William stood at the head. His cousin Richard spoke before William began. He was a broad man with silver hair and a friendly face that made Annie dislike him at once. "Will, if this is about the article circulating online, our communications people can handle." "This is not about an article," William said. Another cousin, Patricia, glanced at Annie. "Then perhaps you should tell us why we're here." William placed a folder on the table. "Daniel had a daughter." The room went quiet. Richard frowned. "Daniel? My brother." Patricia's eyes moved to Rose. "I thought Daniel left the family," Rose said. "He left the house, not the blood in his body." Richard's mouth tightened. "Mrs. Brooks," Rose said. "Rose Brooks, his wife." The word wife moved around the table like a stain no one wanted to touch. William opened the folder and removed the certified DNA report. He did not pass it around. He placed it in front of himself. "This confirms Annie Brooks is Daniel's daughter." A younger man at the far end gave a low whistle. "Well, hell." Margaret's eyes closed. Patricia leaned forward. "William, Surely we need counsel before statements like that are made. No, William said. Counsel can join later. Family hears it first. Richard looked at Annie with a smile so soft it became insulting. Young lady, I'm sure this is overwhelming for you. Annie looked at him. Not as overwhelming as being talked around. Rose almost smiled. Richard cleared his throat. I only meant, I know what you meant, Annie said. People usually do. William kept his voice calm. Daniel was cut off because he married Rose. He wrote to me for years. Those letters were kept from me. His child was kept from this family. Patricia looked at Margaret. Aunt Margaret? Margaret opened her eyes. The whole room waited for the old command to return. The polished denial. The family version that made everything difficult sound necessary. It did not come. I kept the letters, Margaret said. The silence changed. Richard sat back. Why would you say that? Because it is true. Patricia whispered, My God. William looked at his mother, and Annie saw surprise on his face. He had expected to fight alone. Margaret had not joined him. Not fully. But she had stopped blocking the road. Richard recovered first. This is unfortunate, but we need to consider exposure. If Daniel's estate, Rose said. He turned to her. I'm speaking practically. No, Rose said. You're speaking like a man who hears about a dead relative and checks the locks on the silver cabinet. Annie looked down to hide her smile. William said, Annie is not here to ask for anything. Richard relaxed too soon. William continued, I am here to give what should have been hers already. Recognition. Daniel's name returns to the family records. Rose is acknowledged as his wife. Annie is acknowledged as his daughter. Daniel's portrait returns to the front hall, and no one in this room will speak of them as claimants, complications, or mistakes. Patricia said, You can't decide that alone. William looked at her. Watch me. Margaret's voice came from across the table. He is not deciding alone. Everyone turned. Margaret sat straight, but her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. Daniel was my son. I wronged him. I wronged his wife. I wronged this girl before I knew her name. If anyone here is worried about embarrassment, begin with me. Annie stared at her. Rose did too. For the first time, Margaret had not hidden behind the word family. Richard looked irritated. Aunt Margaret, you're emotional. She looked at him the way only an old Southern woman with money could. Cold enough to frost glass. Richard, I have been called many things. Emotional is not the one that should frighten you. William nearly laughed. Annie did. Just once. The room turned toward her. She let them. Then she stood. Rose touched her wrist, but Annie gave a small shake of her head. I didn't come here for your money, Annie said. My mama kept us fed. My daddy kept us loved. Rose's kitchen kept its lights on without a Whitmore check. No one interrupted. I came because my father wrote letters to people who never answered. I came because his picture was taken off a wall. I came because some of you are looking at me like I'm news you hope goes away by Monday. Richard looked down. Annie's voice stayed steady. I don't need your name to know who I am, but my father had it first. And you don't get to keep the parts of him that look good in portraits while throwing away the woman and child he loved. Rose's eyes filled, but she did not wipe them. William looked at Annie with open pride, then caught himself because pride had to be earned too. Margaret whispered, Daniel would have liked that. Annie looked at her. He should have been here to hear it. Yes, Margaret said. He should have. No apology could fill the empty chair. But the chair was visible now. And that was why. When William closed the folder and said the family would gather at the Whitmore house the next day to return Daniel's portrait, no one at the table dared call it unnecessary. The Whitmore house had been built to impress people before they reached the front door. The driveway curved through oaks hung with Spanish moss, past a fountain no one seemed to enjoy, toward white columns that rose like they had been ordered to stand straight for generations. Annie sat in the back seat beside Rose and watched the house grow larger through the windshield. This time she did not feel small. She felt watched, not by the house, exactly, but by the men and women in the portraits inside it, the ones whose names had been protected while her father's had been packed into boxes and carried upstairs like old Christmas ornaments. Rose touched Annie's knee. You don't have to do anything in there you don't want to do. I know. You can leave any time. I know that too. Rose studied her, knowing and feeling her cousins. not twins. Annie looked at her mother. Did Daddy feel nervous when he came here? Rose's hand stilled. Every time. He still came? Once. Maybe more than he told me. Rose looked toward the house. Your father was stubborn in ways that broke my heart. William opened Rose's door before the driver could. Then he opened Annie's. He was wearing a dark suit, but no tie. Annie noticed. Yesterday he had said Daniel hated ties. Ready? He asked. No, Annie said. William nodded. That may be the honest answer for all of us. Inside, the family had already gathered in the front hall. The same cousins from the bank stood near the staircase. Richard was there with his arms folded, speaking quietly to Patricia until Annie entered. A few older relatives Annie had not met stood beneath portraits, pretending not to stare. Margaret waited near the center of the hall, dressed in black, her face composed but tired. Beside her, covered with a canvas cloth, leaned Daniel's portrait. Samuel stood next to it. He had polished the frame. Annie could smell lemon oil. William walked to the middle of the hall. Thank you for coming, Richard murmured. You made it sound less optional. William looked at him. It was. That ended the muttering. Rose stood on Annie's left, William on her right. Annie did not miss the shape of it. Neither did Margaret. Samuel removed the canvas. Daniel looked out at them. Younger than Annie had ever known him. Cleaner than the father who fixed leaky sinks and carried flour sacks into the diner pantry. But still Daniel. The eyes were the same. A little amused. A little unwilling to be tamed. Someone behind Annie whispered, I forgot how much he looked like Henry. Margaret turned. He looked like himself. The whisper died. William looked at his mother, surprised. Margaret kept her eyes on the portrait. He always did. Two men from the estate staff lifted the frame. Samuel guided them to the open space between William's portrait and an older painting of Henry Whitmore. The wall had been empty when Annie first saw it, though the faded rectangle on the wallpaper made clear something had once hung there. Daniel had not simply been forgotten. He had left an outline. The men raised the portrait onto the hook. For a moment, it tilted. Samuel lifted a hand, adjusted the bottom corner, and stepped back. Daniel returned to the front hall without a sound. Rose's breath caught beside Annie. Annie reached for her mother's hand. William spoke quietly. Welcome home, Danny. Margaret closed her eyes. Richard shifted. All right. The portrait is back. Can we discuss next steps in a reasonable manner? Rose's hand tightened around Annie's. William turned slowly. Reasonable? Richard sighed. William, don't make me the villain for saying what everyone is thinking. Recognition is one thing. Legal exposure is another. There are trusts, old documents, inheritance questions, press risks. We have to be careful. Annie looked at him. Careful for who? He blinked. For everyone. No, she said. That word keeps getting used in this family when people mean themselves. Patricia looked uncomfortable. Annie, this is complicated. It was complicated for my father, too. He just didn't have lawyers to make it sound cleaner. Rose said softly, That's enough, baby. But Margaret stepped forward. No, she said. Let her speak. The hall went still. Margaret turned to Richard. You are not wrong that there will be legal matters, but you are wrong about what comes first. Richard looked wary. Aunt Margaret, what comes first is the truth. She paused, and the pause seemed to cost her. Daniel did not disappear. He was pushed out. By me, by this house, by a family more afraid of gossip than grief. No one spoke. Margaret's voice stayed controlled, but Annie heard the break under it. He married Rose. He built a life. He had a daughter. He wrote letters that should have reached William. I kept them. Patricia's hand went to her mouth. Richard stared. Why would you admit that in front of staff? Samuel lifted his chin. Margaret looked at Richard with open disgust. Because Samuel has carried more truth in this house than most blood relatives. Samuel's eyes filled, but he did not lower them. William looked at his mother as if she were becoming someone he did not know how to hate properly. Margaret turned toward Annie. There is something I need to read, she said. Annie's stomach tightened. What? Margaret took a folded page from the small black purse in her hand. Your father's letter to me. Not all of it. Some things belong to the people he wrote them to. But this part should have been heard in this hall, years ago. Rose's face hardened. Did you ask Annie if she wanted that? Margaret looked at Annie. May I? The question hung there. Annie thought about saying no. Part of her wanted to. Not because the words were not Daniel's, but because Margaret had kept so many things that asking permission now felt too late to be fair. But Daniel's portrait was on the wall. The family was listening. And her father had spent too many years unheard. Annie nodded. "Read it." Margaret unfolded the page with both hands. Her voice was thin at first. "Mother, I know what you think I chose. You think I chose embarrassment over duty. You think I chose Rose over family. From where I stand, I chose not to let the people who raised me decide which parts of my heart were respectable." The hall did not move. Margaret continued, "I love Rose because when I am with her, I do not feel like a son being measured. I feel like a man being known." Rose looked down. Annie leaned into her, shoulder to shoulder. Margaret's voice shook but held. "If I have a child one day, I will not teach that child to hate you. That would still make you too large in my house. But I will not teach that child to beg for you either. If you want to be family, you will have to come as family, not as a queen inspecting damage." A faint sound passed through the relatives. No one spoke. Margaret lowered the letter, then looked at Rose. "He knew me too well." Rose's answer was quiet. "He loved you anyway. That was one of his problems." Margaret accepted it. Then she faced the room. "I came as a queen for too long. That ends today. Annie Brooks is Daniel's daughter. Rose Brooks was his wife. If anyone here speaks of them as a threat to the family, you will answer to me first." Richard looked stunned. "You can't simply rewrite history." Annie said, "No, but you can stop lying about it." William almost smiled. Patricia looked from Annie to the portrait. "What do you want from us?" Annie had not expected the question. She felt every eye turned toward her. Rose whispered, "Take your time." Annie looked at Daniel's portrait. She thought of him in the diner, his hands dusted with flour, his laugh coming out in coughs near the end, his old jacket hanging by the pantry door. He would have hated this hallway. He would have made a joke because silence made him nervous. He would have looked for William first. Annie turned back to the family. "I don't want a performance," she said. "I don't want everyone suddenly acting like my father was always welcome here. He wasn't." No one argued. "I don't want people smiling at me in public and whispering about my mama in private. I don't want charity. I don't want someone asking if I'm changing my last name like Brooks is something I need rescued from." Rose's eyes shone. Annie's voice stayed steady. "I want my father's name spoken with respect. I want my mother treated as his wife. I want those letters copied and kept with family records, not hidden in a storage room. And I want anybody who can't do that to be honest enough to stay away." For a moment, the only sound was the old house settling. Then Samuel said, "Amen." Rose gave him a look. He cleared his throat. "Apologies, ma'am. It seemed called for." A small laugh moved through the room. Not enough to make things light, enough to let people breathe. William stepped beside Annie. "Everything she said will be done." Richard opened his mouth. Margaret cut him off. "Not debated. Done." For the first time since Annie had met her, Margaret sounded like the old matriarch again. The difference was that, this time, her command stood on the right side of the room. When the family began to disperse, some avoiding Annie's eyes, some offering awkward nods, Patricia approached Rose. "I'm sorry," she said. Rose looked at her. "For what exactly?" Patricia faltered. Rose waited. Patricia swallowed. "For not asking questions when Daniel's name stopped being mentioned." Rose studied her. "That's a start." Patricia nodded and walked away. Annie remained under the portrait after everyone else moved toward the sitting room. William stood near her but did not speak. Margaret came last. She looked up at Daniel's face. "I forgot he had that half smile." Annie said, "He did it when he knew something funny and wasn't ready to share." Margaret glanced at her. Yes, they stood together, not close, but not as far apart as before. Margaret said, "I do not expect you to call me anything." "Good." The answer came too quickly, but Margaret did not flinch. "I would like," Margaret said, choosing each word with care, "to know what he was like as your father, when you are willing." Annie looked at Daniel's portrait. He made terrible pancakes. Margaret blinked. Rose, from a few feet away, laughed under her breath. Annie continued, "He said they were animals. They were mostly shapes with burns." Margaret's mouth trembled. "He burned toast as a boy. Never got better." For the first time, something passed between them that did not feel like argument. Small, uneasy, real. William looked at Daniel's portrait. and then at the two women standing beneath it, mother and daughter divided by history, connected by the same man. The portrait had returned to the wall, but the harder work had just begun. For 3 days after Daniel's portrait returned to the front hall, Rose refused every invitation to stay for dinner at the Whitmore house. William asked once. Margaret asked once, through William. Patricia sent a handwritten note with the words "no pressure" underlined twice. Rose read it at the counter, folded it back into the envelope, and slid it beneath the sugar tin. Annie watched her. "You're not going to answer?" Rose poured batter onto the waffle iron. "I answered by not answering. That seems like something Daddy would say. Your daddy would have made it sound funnier." The diner had changed since the family meeting, though no one had changed the furniture, the menu, or the bell over the door. People looked in longer through the windows. Customers who had known Rose for years now spoke Daniel's name more carefully, as if realizing they had been standing near a story without seeing the size of it. Mrs. Hanley came in with a casserole the next morning, not because anyone had died, she said, but because old grief counts too. Mr. Ellis left a folded newspaper clipping on the counter about the Whitmore Foundation and muttered, "Never did trust folks with that many buildings named after them." Marcus asked Annie if she was secretly rich now, then apologized before she could answer. Annie told him, "If I were rich, you think I'd still be polishing ketchup bottles?" Marcus grinned. "You'd make me polish them." "Exactly." That little laugh helped. Not much, but enough. On Thursday evening, William came after closing. He arrived in an old blue pickup instead of the black Lincoln or the silver sedan. The truck looked too ordinary for him, with a dent near the rear fender and dust on the tires. Rose stood behind the counter and stared through the window. "What is he driving?" Annie looked up from wrapping forks in paper napkins. "Looks like a truck. I can see it's a truck." William stepped inside holding a cardboard box. It was Daniel's. Rose went still. Annie set down the napkins. William placed the box on the nearest table. Samuel found the title in the estate records. It sat in one of the old carriage sheds for years. I had no idea. Mother says Daniel left it behind the night he left. I had it towed and cleaned, but I didn't restore anything. I thought... He stopped and looked at Rose. "I thought you should decide." Rose walked around the counter slowly. "He thought that truck was gone." "I know." "No," she said, touching the hood through the window with her eyes before she ever touched the keys. "You don't know. He talked about that truck like some men talk about a dog that ran off." William held out the keys. "Then it belongs here." Rose did not take them. Annie did. The metal was warm from William's hand. A small silver eagle keychain hung from the ring. Not old, not Daniel's, but simple and new. Rose noticed. "You buy that?" William nodded. "Too much?" "A little. I'm learning." Annie stepped outside first. The evening smelled of rain and cut grass. Rose followed, wiping her hands on her apron, though they were already clean. William stayed by the door, giving them the space. The truck's blue paint had faded almost gray in places. The bench seat was cracked. The steering wheel was worn smooth. In the rear window was the ghost of an old decal, peeled away years ago but still visible when the light hit it. Rose opened the driver's door and leaned in. For a long time, she said nothing. Then she laughed once, soft and wounded. "He kept a pack of peppermint gum in that ashtray. Said it helped him think. It didn't. It just made him smell like a church lady's purse." Annie smiled. "Daddy chewed gum?" "Only when he was nervous." William came closer but stopped near the front bumper. "He chewed it before exams. Before asking Father for anything. Before sneaking out." Rose looked at him. "You remember that night?" "Yes." "Then remember all of it." William nodded. "I watched him put one suitcase in this truck. I watched him look back at the house. I thought he was looking for Mother." "He wasn't," Rose said. William's eyes lowered. "He was looking for me." Rose did not spare him. "Yes." Annie stood between them, the keys in her palm. "Did you go outside?" "No." "Why?" William looked at her. "Because I was afraid if I did, I'd have to choose. And you chose by staying in." "Yes." Rose crossed her arms. "That is one thing your family is finally saying right." William accepted it. "I'd like to make another offer." Rose's face closed. "Careful. It's not money. People with money always say that right before money walks in wearing a hat." Annie snorted despite herself. William almost smiled. Fair. It is partly money, but not charity. I want to set up an education trust in Daniel's name. For Annie. She chooses the school. She keeps Brooks. No conditions, no publicity, no speeches. It would be handled privately. Rose's answer came fast. No. Annie turned. Mama. Rose looked at her. Don't mama me. We are not being purchased. I didn't say we were. You're thinking it could help. It could. That's how money talks, baby. Soft at first. William said. Rose, you're right to question it. But Daniel was my brother. If I had known about Annie, I would have helped. Rose turned on him. But you didn't know. And you didn't know because comfort suited you. Yes. So don't make the helping part sound like a memory you earned. William went quiet. Annie looked from one adult to the other. She was tired of money being treated like poison or medicine depending on who held it. Can I say something? Rose's jaw tightened, but she nodded. Annie held the keys in both hands. Daddy worked sick because the bills didn't care if he was proud. You worked double shifts because the diner didn't care if you were tired. I put off school because love doesn't pay tuition. That doesn't mean I want his money. But I don't want to keep suffering just to prove the Whitmores hurt us. Rose looked away. That one landed. William said nothing wisely. Annie continued, softer now. If Uncle William wants to do something in Daddy's name, then it has to honor Daddy. Not fix guilt. Not buy us. Honor him. Rose turned back. The word uncle had not passed unnoticed. William looked down at the pavement like it had struck him somewhere tender. Rose asked, and what would that look like? Annie thought for a moment. Not just me. A Daniel Brooks Whitmore scholarship. For kids who work in family businesses, kids who lost a parent, kids who don't have somebody to call when money gets tight. Quiet. No gala. No big picture of William handing out checks. William nodded. Done. Rose shot him a look. Too fast. He corrected himself. I mean, I would like that, if you both approve the terms. Annie looked at her mother. And my school comes from that same fund. Not because I'm a poor girl you rescued. Because I'm Daniel's daughter, and he would have wanted me to go. Rose's face trembled, but she held herself together. He did want that. I know. The rain started then, light at first, tapping the diner awning. Rose looked at the truck, then at the keys in Annie's hand. Your father would have hated all this talking. He wrote letters for 20 years, Annie said. I think he liked talking on paper. Rose laughed, and this time it stayed a little longer. William reached into the cardboard box he had brought and took out a folder. There's something else. Rose sighed. Lord, rich people come with paperwork. This one matters. He opened the folder and removed a copy of a family record. The Whitmore genealogy, typed and bound, with Daniel's name printed beneath Henry and Margaret. Beside his name, where there had once been only a dash, someone had added, husband of Rose Brooks, father of Annie Brooks. Rose took the page. Her eyes moved over the words. Annie read them too. Daniel Brooks Whitmore. Not hidden, not corrected, not erased. Rose pressed her lips together. Who approved this? I did. Will your family fight it? Some will. And? William looked toward the truck. Let them. Rose studied him for a long time. You say that now. I'll say it tomorrow too. We'll see. Yes, he said. You will. The rain grew harder. Annie climbed into the driver's seat of Daniel's old truck. The bench smelled faintly of vinyl, dust, and something mechanical that made her chest ache. Rose leaned in the open window. You ever driven column shift? No. Then don't start it unless you want to hit the pie case. William cleared his throat. I can teach her. Rose looked at him. He quickly added, or not. Annie laughed. Daddy would have taught me. Rose's face softened. He taught me. Badly. William said. He taught everyone badly. Rose glanced at him then, and for a second they shared Daniel without fighting over him. It was gone quickly, but Annie saw it. Later, after William left and Rose locked the diner, Annie sat in the truck with her mother, parked under the awning while rain ran down the windshield. Rose held the family record in her lap. You called him Uncle William, she said. Annie stared ahead. It slipped. Did it? I don't know. Rose nodded. You don't have to decide what he is tonight. I know. And you don't have to reject help just because hurt brought it late. Annie looked at her mother. Rose wiped one tear with the back of her hand, annoyed at it. I'm still mad. You can be. I may be mad a long time. You can be that too. Rose looked at the truck's dashboard. But your father used to say pride makes a poor blanket. Annie smiled. Did he? No, I just wish he had. Sounds like him. They sat there until the rain slowed. Inside the diner, Daniel's letters rested in neat boxes. On the wall, near the register, Rose had placed the baby photograph Margaret had given back. Not displayed yet. Just leaning there, as if testing whether it belonged. Annie looked at it through the window. Her father's past had come in pieces. A patch, a letter, a truck, a name on paper. None of them brought him back, but each one returned a little of what had been taken. The next day, Rose would reopen the diner. William would call lawyers. Margaret would have to face relatives who preferred silence. Annie would have to decide what it meant to accept a future paid for by a family that had denied her past. But for that night, she sat in her father's truck with her mother beside her, the rain soft above them, the keys warm in her hand. And for the first time since the silver eagle appeared in a stranger's coat, Annie felt the door her father left behind open not to a mansion, not to money, but to a road. The scholarship papers took a week to draft and 3 days for Rose to read. William's lawyer sent the first version in a folder thick enough to make Annie laugh. Rose did not laugh. She sat at the counter after closing, red pen in hand, reading every page like it might try to steal something if she blinked. William sat across from her with a mug of coffee he had learned not to leave untouched. Annie was in the last booth with college brochures spread around her, pretending not to listen. Rose turned a page. This says the foundation may use recipient stories for promotional purposes. William leaned forward. Strike it. His lawyer, a tired woman named Denise who had driven from Atlanta and quickly learned Rose was not decorative, made a note. Rose kept reading. This says preference may be given to applicants demonstrating family hardship. Denise said, That's standard language. Rose looked at her. Hardship is not a costume for rich people to admire. Denise paused, then nodded. I'll revise, William said. Make it about resilience, work, and need. No sad stories required. Rose looked at him. You came up with that yourself? I had help from being corrected. Good. Correction is cheaper than character if you accept it early. Annie smiled down at her brochures. The Daniel Brooks Whitmore Scholarship became real on a Thursday afternoon, without cameras, speeches, or a gala. It would help students from small family businesses, students who had lost a parent, and students whose lives had been delayed by illness, work, or bills. Annie's tuition would come from it, but her name would not be used to advertise it. That was Rose's condition, Annie's condition, and by then William had learned that conditions from the Brooks women were not obstacles. They were instructions on how to stay welcome. Margaret did not attend the signing. She sent a handwritten note instead. Rose read it once, folded it, and set it beside the register. Annie picked it up later when her mother went to the kitchen. Mrs. Brooks, I am learning that apology is not a sentence but a practice. I will not ask for your trust. I will try to stop making distrust necessary. Margaret Whitmore. Annie read it twice. Rose came back with a towel over her shoulder. You snooping? It was on the counter. That's where people snoop. Annie put the note down. What do you think? Rose looked at the folded paper. I think she writes better than she speaks. That's not an answer. It's the one I have. A few days later, William asked if Annie wanted to see the college campus in Macon. Rose said she could go if they took Daniel's truck, which made William stare at her like she had handed him a rattlesnake. You want me to drive that truck? I want you to teach her without hiding behind heated seats. Annie laughed. Mama. Rose tossed the keys to William. Column shift. She needs to learn. Daniel would haunt us both if she didn't. William caught the keys, then looked at Annie. Your father taught me badly, so I may pass down a family tradition. Great, Annie said. Generational trauma with a clutch. Rose pointed at her. Don't get smart and stall in traffic. They stalled twice before leaving Bell Creek. The first time, William apologized to the truck. The second time, Annie laughed so hard she forgot to be embarrassed. By the time they reached the highway, she had one hand steady on the wheel and William watching the road like a man who had invested emotionally in every mailbox. You're tense, Annie said. I am not tense. You grabbed the dashboard. A reflex. You whispered break when I was already breaking. That was encouragement. That was fear. William looked out the window. You drive like Daniel. Is that bad? Yes, he said. Then after a beat, and no, the campus was smaller than Annie expected, with brick buildings, dogwoods, and students crossing the lawn with backpacks and iced coffee. William walked beside her. Not ahead. He let the admissions counselor speak to Annie, not him. He did not mention money. He did not use his last name until the counselor recognized him and stiffened. Annie saw it happen. William saw her see it. He said, "Today is Miss Brooks's visit. I'm just the nervous uncle." The word uncle came out easier this time. Annie pretended to study a bulletin board so he would not see her face. On the drive back, she asked, "Did Daddy ever talk about college?" He said school made him impatient. That sounds right. But he loved learning. He learned engines, cooking, carpentry, weather patterns, birds. He once tried to learn banjo. Annie glanced over. Tried? Your grandmother threatened to move out. Annie laughed. Which grandmother? William hesitated. The question had slipped out before Annie could take it back. He answered carefully. The one who now regrets many things, including her opinion on banjo. Annie nodded and kept driving. When they returned, Margaret was waiting outside Rose's kitchen. She wore a simple blue dress and held a paper sack from the bakery down the street. She looked at Daniel's truck, then at Annie behind the wheel. Something moved across her face. Not claim, not pride exactly, but the ache of seeing the past drive up with a different person at the wheel. Rose came out before Annie could speak. Margaret lifted the sack. I brought rolls. From Sweet May's. Rose looked at the bag. We serve food here. I know. Then why bring food? Margaret looked at the sign above the diner. Because I don't know how to arrive empty. Handed. Rose accepted that, though not the bag. Annie likes cinnamon rolls. Margaret turned to Annie. These are cinnamon. Annie took the sack. Thank you. Margaret nodded, too formal. You're welcome. William leaned against the truck, watching the exchange without interfering. He had started to learn that some bridges collapsed if too many people stood on them at once. Margaret looked at Rose. May I sit outside? Not inside. I don't want to intrude. Rose studied her. Outside is public. Yes. There's a table by the window. Thank you. Margaret sat there with a paper cup of coffee Rose eventually brought out. She did not complain that it was too strong. She did not ask for a saucer. She simply sat, watching people come and go, seeing the life Daniel had chosen, not as an insult to her but as something she had failed to honor. That evening, after the diner closed, Annie found Margaret still outside. You don't have to sit out here like punishment, Annie said. Margaret looked up. Perhaps I do. That won't fix anything. No, Margaret said, but it keeps me from pretending I have a place inside before I'm given one. Annie sat across from her. The streetlights came on one by one. Somewhere down the block, Marcus laughed with someone near the alley. Rose was inside counting the register. William had gone to take a call. Margaret took a small breath. Your father hated carrots. Annie blinked. What? As a boy, he would hide them in his napkin. Poorly, the napkin would turn orange, and he would insist it was natural fabric variation. Annie smiled before she could stop herself. Margaret saw it and looked down, as if the smile was more than she deserved to witness directly. He used to tell me carrots were just potatoes with a bad attitude, Annie said. Margaret laughed. It was small, and it surprised them both. Annie looked toward the diner window. Rose had stopped counting and was watching them through the glass. She did not look angry. She did not look pleased. She looked careful. Margaret followed Annie's gaze. Your mother is a remarkable woman. I know. I should have known sooner. Yes, Annie said. You should have. Margaret accepted it. The following Saturday, William brought Daniel's jacket back to the diner. He had not taken it without asking. Rose had given it to him for one reason only. The lining near the old patch outline was tearing, and William knew a tailor who could repair it by hand. But when he returned it, the jacket was not in a garment bag. It was folded in his arms. Rose narrowed her eyes. Tell me you didn't make it fancy. I didn't. Tell me you didn't replace anything. I didn't. Annie came closer. William unfolded the jacket on the counter. The tear had been mended with careful brown thread. The old outline where the patch once sat remained visible. Beside it, William had stitched a small square of cloth on the inside lining, not covering the old mark. Protecting it, Rose touched the repair. "You did this?" "The tailor started it. I finished." Annie looked at the stitches. "They're crooked." "Yes. Daddy's were crooked too." William's face softened. "I know." Rose lifted the jacket, then handed it to Annie. "Try it on." Annie slipped into it. The sleeves still fell too long. The shoulders were too wide. It smelled of clean fabric now, but beneath that, maybe only in Annie's mind, there was still something of Daniel. Motor oil, coffee, rain. William reached into his pocket and took out his own silver eagle patch. He placed it on the counter. "I want you to keep this," he said. Annie stared at it. "That's yours." It was ours, then it was mine. Now I think it belongs where Daniel's daughter can decide what it means. Rose looked at William. "You sure?" "No," he said. "But I'm learning that giving back what I held too long is rarely comfortable." Annie picked up the patch. 2 silver eagles now lay in her life. One from her father, one from the brother who arrived late. She did not put William's patch in the wooden box. Not yet. She slipped it into Daniel's jacket pocket. William saw and said nothing. That night, Rose, Annie, William, and Margaret ate together in the diner after closing. Not a family dinner exactly. Not yet. Rose made fried chicken, collard greens, biscuits, and peach cobbler. Margaret offered to help set the table and put forks on the wrong side of the plates. Annie corrected her. Margaret thanked her, which made Rose turn away to hide a smile. William washed dishes badly. Rose finally took the sponge from him. "You're just moving grease around." "I was trying. That's not the same as helping." Noted. At the table, Margaret asked Annie about nursing school. Annie answered carefully at first, then more easily when Margaret asked normal questions and did not try to improve the answers. William told a story about Daniel putting a frog in his Sunday shoe. Rose told him Daniel once burned 6 grilled cheese sandwiches in a row and blamed the pan. Annie told them he cried during old dog movies and denied it every time. The stories did not erase what had happened, but they gave Daniel more room. After dinner, Rose stood at the counter, watching Annie and Margaret dry plates side by side. William came beside her. "Thank you," he said. "For dinner?" "For not closing the door." Rose kept her eyes on Annie. "Daniel left me in charge of how wide to open it." "I remember." "It's not wide, William." "I know. It may never be wide the way you want." He nodded. "Then I'll learn to stand where I'm allowed." Rose looked at him then. "That might be the first wise thing you've said." He smiled faintly. "I'll try not to ruin it." Across the room, Annie laughed at something Margaret said. Rose listened, and grief moved through her, but not alone this time. Outside, Daniel's old truck sat under the streetlight. Rainwater dried from its hood, the silver eagle keychain catching a small bit of light through the windshield. Inside, his jacket hung on the back of Annie's chair. One patch in the box, one in the pocket. Both waiting. The house Daniel had built with Rose was still small. The family around it was still uncertain. But for the first time, the table had more chairs than ghosts. The morning Annie left for college, Rose burned the first tray of biscuits. She blamed the oven. Annie stood by the counter with 2 suitcases near her feet and gave her mother the look Daniel used to give when Rose tried to blame cookware for human trouble. Rose pointed the spatula at her. "Don't start." "I didn't say anything." "You thought it loud." William came through the front door carrying a cardboard box labeled Annie Dorm in black marker. He had dressed down for the occasion, jeans and a pale blue shirt, but he still looked like a man who had asked someone whether the clothes were casual enough. Margaret followed him with a small paper bag from Sweet May's bakery. Rose looked at them both. "We are not feeding her sugar before a 2-hour drive." Margaret paused. "It's for later." Annie took the bag and peeked inside. "Cinnamon rolls?" Margaret nodded. "The woman said they travel well." Rose muttered. "The woman says anything that sells rolls." But she did not take the bag away. That was how things had changed. Not in grand speeches, not in clean forgiveness, in small permissions. Margaret coming through the diner door without making the room stiffen. William washing dishes badly but less badly each week. Rose letting them sit after closing. Annie learning that accepting help did not mean handing over her spine. Daniel's old truck sat outside, polished but not restored. Rose said restored things sometimes lost the proof they had lived. William had paid for the engine work only after Rose made him write on the invoice. Maintenance, not rescue. Annie had taped that invoice inside the glove compartment because it made her laugh. The silver eagle patches were no longer hidden in separate places. Daniel's rested in the wooden box at Rose's kitchen, along with copies of his letters. William's rested in the inside pocket of Daniel's jacket, which Annie wore despite the warm Georgia morning. The sleeves still hung a little too long. Rose touched one cuff. "You'll roast in that before making. I'll take it off in the truck." "You won't." "No," Annie said. "Probably not." Rose's mouth trembled, and she turned away to wrap the second tray of biscuits before anyone could see too much. William set the dorm box near the door. "You have the scholarship paperwork?" Annie gave him a look. "Uncle William." He stopped. The title still hit him sometimes. Annie could see it in the way his face changed, the brief lowering of his eyes, as if gratitude had become too heavy to hold standing up. "Yes," he said. "I have the paperwork. Mama checked it. Denise checked it. Marcus checked it, even though he mostly looked for spelling errors so he could feel involved." From the kitchen pass, Marcus called, "I found two." Rose yelled back, "One was your own name." Margaret laughed first. Everyone noticed. Margaret noticed them noticing and straightened. "It was funny." "It was," Annie said. The bell over the door rang, and Samuel Reed came in carrying a framed photograph wrapped in brown paper. He had moved slower in recent weeks, but there was steadiness in him now, the kind that comes when a man has finally stopped guarding the wrong door. "For Miss Annie," he said. Annie took the frame and unwrapped it. It was the photograph of Daniel and William at Lake Sinclair, the one Margaret had given back. But Samuel had placed beneath it a small brass plate engraved with Daniel's old words. "Brothers don't get lost." Annie swallowed. "Thank you, Mr. Samuel." He nodded. "Your father's handwriting deserved a frame." Rose stepped closer, touched the edge, then looked at Margaret. "You approve this?" Margaret's hands folded over her purse. "I asked him to make two, one for Annie, one for the front hall." Rose took that in. "The front hall?" Margaret nodded. "Beside Daniel's portrait. Not replacing anything, just adding what should have been there." William looked at his mother, and for once he did not look surprised, only quiet. Rose said, "That's good." Margaret's eyes shone, but she did not reach for more than the words offered. "Thank you." They drove to the cemetery before leaving for campus. Annie had asked for it. Rose had not argued. William followed in his sedan with Margaret and Samuel. No one made it formal. No one called it a ceremony. They simply gathered around Daniel's grave with coffee and paper cups, cinnamon rolls in a bag, and the morning sun lifting through the dogwood leaves. Rose set fresh flowers by the stone. "Morning, Daniel," she said, as always. Annie crouched and placed a small college pennant against the base of the headstone. "I'm going," she said. "Mama's pretending not to panic. Uncle William is pretending not to overplan." Grandma Margaret brought cinnamon rolls. The word came out before she measured it. "Grandma." The cemetery went still. Annie did not look back at first. She kept her eyes on the stone, on her father's name, on the line beneath it. "A man who chose love." Behind her, Margaret made a sound so small it might have been mistaken for breath. Rose looked at Annie, then at Margaret. William looked at the ground. Annie stood and turned. Margaret had one hand at her mouth. Tears had gathered, but she made no move to claim the moment. She did not step forward. She did not ask Annie to repeat it. She only stood there, receiving what had not been owed to her. Annie walked to her and said quietly, "Don't make me regret it." Margaret nodded fast once. "I won't." "That's a promise." "Yes." Rose watched them, grief and caution both present in her face. Then she looked at Daniel's grave. "You hear that? Your daughter giving orders," William said. "She comes by it honestly." Rose glanced at him. "From me. Mostly. Careful." He smiled. "Yes, ma'am." After a while, William stepped to the grave alone. He placed one hand on the top of the stone. "Danny," he said softly, "she's going to be all right." Rose stood beside him. "She was always going to be all right." "I know." "No," Rose said. "You're learning." He accepted that. "I am." Rose reached into her purse and took out a folded copy of Daniel's first letter, the one that said, "I want my child to know she has an uncle." She handed it to William. "I made you a copy." He looked at it, then at her. "Thank you." "Don't thank me too much. I still get mad when I read it." "So do I." "Good," Rose said. "Maybe anger can keep you honest." William folded the letter carefully and placed it inside his jacket. At the campus, the dorm room was smaller than the brochure had promised and hotter than anyone expected. Rose inspected the mattress. William assembled a shelf upside down before Annie corrected him. Margaret made the bed with hospital corners so sharp Annie said she was afraid to sleep in it. Samuel put the framed photograph on the desk, then adjusted it twice. When everything was done, there was nothing left to do but leave. That was the hardest part. Rose stood in the doorway, holding herself together by force. Annie stepped into her arms. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, Rose whispered, "Call when you get lonely. Call when you don't. Call if you need money. Call if you don't. Call if the food is bad." Annie laughed into her shoulder. "Mama, I'm serious about the food." "I know." William hugged her next, awkward at first, then less so when Annie held on. "Study hard," he said. "That's the best you've got?" "I had a speech in the car." "What happened?" "You looked at me." She smiled. "Bye, Uncle William." He nodded, unable to answer. Margaret stood last. She did not open her arms. She had learned to wait at doors. Annie stepped forward and hugged her. Margaret froze for half a second, then folded both arms around her carefully, like holding something breakable that had chosen not to break. "Thank you," Margaret whispered. Annie pulled back. "Write me letters." Margaret blinked. "Letters? Daddy wrote them. Maybe we should try answering." Margaret's face crumpled and steadied. "I will." When they left, Annie stood at the dorm window and watched the cars pull away. Rose's truck first, William's sedan behind it. At the edge of the lot, Daniel's old truck paused. Rose rolled down the window and lifted one hand. Annie lifted hers. Then the truck turned onto the road. That night, after unpacking, Annie placed the silver eagle patch from William inside Daniel's frame on her desk, not covering the photograph, just beside it. Her father had left behind a door. For a while, Annie had thought opening it meant walking into the Whitmore world, but now she understood better. The door had opened both ways. It had let truth into Rose's kitchen. It had let Daniel back into the front hall. It had let Margaret step outside her pride and William step inside his grief. It had let Annie leave home without leaving behind the people who made her. Some families break because love disappears. Others break because pride speaks louder than love, and fear stays quiet when it should stand up. But sometimes a daughter finds an old patch, a mother tells the truth, and a brother finally learns that being late does not excuse him from arriving. Justice does not always come like thunder. Sometimes it comes as a name restored to a wall, a chair added to a table, a letter answered after 20 years, and a young woman driving toward her future with her father's love stitched into everything she carries. The lesson of this story is that love should never be measured by race, status, money, or family pride. Daniel lost his family because the people who should have protected him chose reputation over truth. But his love for Rose and Annie remained stronger than the name he was forced to leave behind. The story reminds us that silence can wound as deeply as cruelty, and that being late to do the right thing does not excuse us from doing it. Real justice does not always arrive through punishment. Sometimes it comes when a hidden name is spoken with honor, when a family finally tells the truth, and when the next generation is allowed to walk forward without carrying the shame that never belonged to them. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.